You said that Marx is one of the most brilliant thinkers you've ever read.
There is something structural in capitalism that drives ever greater alienation. The deepest part of his critique of alienation is that the capitalist is alienated. The person who owns the means of production is actually the most alienated. And why? Because he no longer knows how to make anything. He's useless. He's just an owner.
What does it mean to treat employees as ends and not means?
Well, it's to say you are as indispensable as any other one of us, right?
But they aren't, right?
The people here are bound in a deeper way than the alienated serfs that work for our competitors.
Suddenly you made a 180-degree pivot and you ended up building a decacorn, a $10 billion company. Why do you still self-describe as a capitalist nonetheless?
That's fantasy, of course. And you have to just kind of stop reading at that point. This is not a workers' collective. We're trying to succeed in a capitalist world ultimately.
Marcus Ryu was top of his class at Princeton and Oxford before abandoning his philosophical career and founding Guidewire, now worth $15 billion. Marcus attributes a great deal of his entrepreneurial success with applying a simple philosophical technique to startups. But philosophy also prepared Marcus in a much deeper and humanistic way. In this interview, you're going to learn how Nietzsche, Hegel, Marx, and Wittgenstein became invaluable resources through the toughest moments of Marcus's journey, and how we may synthesize action and contemplation in our own lives. My name is Jonathan B. I'm a founding member of Cosmos. We fund research, incubate, and invest in AI startups, and believe that philosophy is critical to building technology. If you want to join our ecosystem of philosopher builders, you can find roles we're hiring for, events we're hosting, and other ways to get involved on jonathanb.com/cosmos. Without further ado, Marcus Ryu. You said that Marx is one of the most brilliant thinkers you've ever read. So what do you think Marx got right, and why do you still self-describe as a capitalist nonetheless?
Oh, yeah. Well, so Marx had an incredibly acute description of what capitalism was. Now, he was writing in the 19th century, but so much of what he said, feels salient today. He characterized the tendency to monopoly capitalism and what happens in that. And I think there are clearly parts of our world today where we're seeing the corrosive effects of monopoly capitalism. He talked about the way that the cultural production is an expression of an underlying material world and a relationship between the different factors of who owns the means of production. And I think the thing that Marx talked about that I really identified at a personal level with was alienation. He talked about alienation, and he has a very poetic description of alienation. So what is alienation? Alienation is when you are divorced from the results of your own efforts, your own labor, right? We're endowed with these faculties to change and move the world, and you are exerting yourself, but the product of what you are creating belongs to someone else, right? And this is the characteristic experience of capitalism for the vast majority of people. You're a barista, you're sitting there like making coffees all day, while other people are drinking, and that you're just a robot. You are, in a way, unplugging from your human faculties of creativity, of expression, and so forth, in order to be a beast of burden to get something done, right? And his description of that alienation and of course he was talking about people doing
factory work.
Doing the most brutal kinds of agricultural or industrial work. But poetically, I really, who has not related to that? Right. That feeling of alienation and the way that alienation kind of is intensified and it seems to be accelerating.
Yeah, with gig work, for example, where you're alienated even from your workforce itself.
And the thing is, it's not necessary. It's not like, well, that's just necessary. There's no other way that work could get done. That's not true. That's not true. Work can be done in an artisanal way. People can have great pride in its creation, right? Just the fact that the work itself is not glamorous doesn't mean that it has to be alienated, right? And he says there is something structural in capitalism that drives ever greater alienation, that turns people just more and more, treats people more and more like instruments. And there is some truth to this. There is unmistakably some truth to this and our current crisis.
Did you feel less alienated when you were building your own company?
Well, that's the difference. And that's yet another motivation. Because when you start a company, and I of course, I was poetic about this with people, but I said, look, I don't know if we're going to succeed. We're up against much bigger competitors. And the work we're doing, let's be clear, it's very, very difficult. And it's very difficult to build our software. It's very difficult to sell it. And it's very difficult to implement it. There's lots of reasons that we may fail, right? But we're going to do it as a craft. You're going to be treated as ends, not means, and we're going to build something great together. Or we're going to fail together. Within the four walls of our shabby little office here, the work is not alienated. We are all one. And we may have different roles. We have different ownership even in this company. We're taking different levels of risk. But we are part of one larger project of which it treats each of us like an end.
Wow. So in Estranged Labor, that is his essay where he mostly outlines the different forms of alienation, right? Alienation from the end product, alienation from your coworkers, for example. Guidewire's sort of values is almost an attempt to respond to Marx within capitalism.
Well,
right?
I didn't frame it that way. It was but in a very high-minded sense. We said the one thing that we have under our power is that we get to. This is not a workers' collective. We're trying to succeed in a capitalist world ultimately. But the way that we are going to work here is not going to be alienated. And and
not just for you, but also for
everyone.
Employees.
No, for everyone.
Right.
For everyone. And that's going to be our offer to you. And everything else here is humble. Like, we cannot offer you any glamour, any possibility of riches. We can offer you below market wages because that's what we're paying ourselves. But you will at least not be alienated here. You are going to be afforded full transparency in the project. You will know your role within it, and we were going to succeed and fail together. And the people who are calling the shots, the leadership of this company, are going to be working harder than you. Okay? And that was an incredibly high-minded idea. It had nothing to do with our market, the fact we were selling to insurance companies. It doesn't matter. But I believe that there was something magical about that. Early stage companies talk about culture all the time, but I think they talk about the wrong aspects. Like, we're going to move fast, we're going to be honest with each other. It's a lot of like superficial bullshit. I mean, not that it doesn't matter. Of course you should be honest with each other, of course, whatever. But the kind of deeper sense that this is a collective in which everyone is an end, not a means, is incredibly powerful if you can actually instantiate that and live up to it.
What does that look like?
Well, I mean, it's not true of the company today, for example. Like, things change. And I have regrets about that because I actually have a theory, if I could replay the tape, that I could have extended that much, much longer.
Oh, so now it is alienated again.
It's a strong word. I'm saying it's lost that kind of crucible-like collective sense of feeling that it had during the really formative years.
What does it mean to treat employees as ends and not means?
Well, it's to say that you are an indispensable part of a collective. Now, you are as indispensable as any other one of us, right?
But they aren't, right?
Well, I mean, the founders of the company are not indispensable in that sense. You're indispensable in that you're not just a unit of labor, right? You have interests in the success of this collective, and your interests will be folded in, and your health, your well-being, your sense of professional fulfillment, your advancement. All of these things are part of the calculus of what we're going to do, because we're trying to create a successful company, but we're trying to create a successful collective. And those two things are not incidentally related. We will be successful as a company precisely because the people here are bound in a deeper way than the alienated serfs that work for our competitors, right?
Right.
That was a very high-minded idea, and you could say it was naive. But the people who were part of those early years were intensely bound by it and came to believe it, and it made all the difference.
Marx's critique in Estranged Labor is aimed not at specific manifestations of capitalism, but aimed at all kinds of capitalistic enterprises. Mm-hmm. So you would basically push back against that. You'd say there is a way to do unestranged labor within capitalism itself.
Oh, well, he has this brilliant critique of the way that capitalism is alienated. And of course, the deepest part of his critique of alienation was that the capitalist is alienated.
Yeah.
The person who owns the means of production is actually the most alienated. And why? Because he no longer knows how to make anything. He's useless. He's just an owner. And this is the most beautiful argument. I mean, that the guy who has all the power, seems to have all the power, has lost his power.
Right.
Because he no longer understands how anything is built, right? Or he can no longer do anything. He's useless. And amazingly, the oppressed end up finding a new source of power that allows for that inversion. There is a deep psychological truth, I think, to that estrangement. And I see it here in Silicon Valley. I know, not just in Silicon Valley, just in the world, I know some incredibly wealthy people that are deeply estranged and have found unhappiness in the midst of astronomical abundance
precisely because of the abundance.
Because of the abundance, and because they've lost a mastery. Like, their only mastery is further accumulation. They've lost a mastery, a creativity, an ability to be anything constructive. They've just, I have witnessed that. And there's other kinds of emotional familial dysfunction that can unfold from that. But where is he incoherent, obviously? It's like, well, where does this lead? Well, first of all, he's part of this kind of, as you know, he adopted the Hegelian framework, which is all of these things have to happen.
Right.
All of these painful stages of feudalism and early brutal capitalism, like that, all that has to happen because they all unfolds into something better. What's that better thing? Well, it's a socialist utopia where the wellspring of abundance just opens, and suddenly, there's so much surplus that
we'll go fishing in the morning, we'll critique in the
and
evening.
We'll paint in the afternoons, and we'll write philosophy in the evening. And that's fantasy, of course. And you have to just kind of stop reading at that point. It's wishful thinking. But I think that diagnosis or aspects of it are profoundly relevant.
I see. Let me give you another quote from yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Severe inequality in income and wealth are not in the long-term interests of any citizens, not even the very wealthy. This is kind of like what you're getting at, with the wealthy being alienated through their wealth. Extreme inequality is corroding our civil society, poisoning our politics, and undermining our effectiveness as a nation. Is inequality today in America too much?
I think so. And I say this as a wealthy person. I mean, a very wealthy person. There's no question that a certain level of inequality is very helpful. It's motivating. It's necessary. You can't have a meritocracy if people aren't allowed to reap the rewards of their differentiated effort and labor and talent. Of course, right? But there's clearly a level at which it becomes corrosive. There's clearly a level where you end up with political capture, and cultural capture, informational capture, and where you end up with profound estrangement of a huge number of people. And that where civil society itself just can't function anymore because it's dominated by just too few individuals whose whims just carry too much weight. And that's just, there's a deep incompatibility with that and a healthy civil society, right?
Right.
Now, are we there? I don't know. I'm not sure. But there are things that are really worrying, and I say that as a very patriotic American, a person who's profoundly grateful to this country. My parents came here. They weren't impoverished, but they were very limited means. And I was able to live every aspect of the American dream to the hilt. But I see the enablers of that happen. I see in full retreat everywhere. For example, the contempt for institutions. I revered my parents came here in reverence of those institutions. That the highest attainment in culture was to perform at Lincoln Center. The highest achievement in education was to go to Harvard University. The highest achievement in journalism was the New York Times. And that kind of reverence for maybe it was a little bit fetishized, but it was a beautiful thing. They anchored our understanding of the world. Now it's everyone's a citizen scientist. Everyone can, maybe injecting horse hormones is a way to insulate ourselves against vaccines because there's a global conspiracy that it's some kind of crazy straw reasoning to lead to places of complete incoherence, distrust, and paranoia. This is terrifying, right? And many, many people have spoken about this, but the kind of epistemic collapse where we can no longer agree on a shared set of facts is deeply terrifying, right? And this is happening. I mean, we're seeing it.
And you attribute the causality, the root cause, as inequality, or that's another manifestation that's unrelated? Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a particularly demonic connection between the shattering of a kind of collective, epistemically coherent universe and inequality, precisely because some of the greatest engines of extreme inequality have been control of information, right? If I had to pick a single enemy in all of it, it would be social media. What's happened with it, because it has somehow shattered our understanding of a common reality, of a common set of facts. A really tiny number of individuals have extremely outsized influence on people's basic understanding of the facts,
Right.
basic information, and that is profoundly undemocratic. That's profoundly dangerous. The natural monopolies that are in the information ecosystem are crushingly powerful. They're more powerful than any monopoly that existed in the physical world or the extractive industries in the past.
You're talking about like Instagram, Facebook, X.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, they are crushingly dominant, and it's because of this completely unappreciated power of the ad tech model until it was too late, right? And we're living in an era of monopoly capitalism now, where a ludicrous portion of the total enterprise value of even publicly traded companies is concentrated in in less than 10 companies, right? And so, and that deforms everything. It deforms talent, it deforms entrepreneurship, it deforms innovation. And everyone knows this. Everyone in Silicon Valley understands this, but nothing is changing it. In fact, you're just ending up with more regulatory capture, more, ever greater concentration of power. And it's actually, it's distressing because part of the Silicon Valley ideology, of course, is that no matter how mighty the incumbent, no matter how powerful the emperor, it's always possible for...
blow up the Death Star.
It's always possible, right? The rebels can get there. And, but one has to question. One has to wonder now, right? And that's disturbing to me as a capitalist, as an entrepreneur. One of the most obvious and pernicious aspects of monopoly is that the products just stagnate. Things get worse. I mean, there was a time in, let's say, the early 2000s where Google was magical. I mean, and it was like year after year, it would release new products that were completely mind-blowingly magical, right? Like you have geolocation of every single useful destination that you may want to go to, and it's free. You have all the movie times that you may want. You have Google Docs. You can now collaborate in real time on documents for free, and just incredible sequence of innovations. It's been complete stagnation. 20 years of a company that's now just been in extractive mode. Everything has gotten worse. Search has gotten worse. Google Docs has gotten worse. Geolocation has gotten worse. Everything has gotten worse, right?
Right.
And you could argue the same for Microsoft. You could say the same for many other tech products.
I see.
And so that's the clearest indicator.
Right. So for the first 2.5 decades of your life, you were on track to be a superstar philosophy academic. And then suddenly you made a 180-degree pivot, and you ended up building a decacorn, a $10 billion company. What are the most important ways you think your training in philosophy, if however subtly, prepared you to build this deca-billion-dollar company?
Well, we had the strategy right, and then we executed on that, right? Sounds so straightforward. Well, the philosophical training is very helpful for defining what a strategy is. For example, one of the things that professional philosophers do, at least in the analytic tradition, is that they value simplicity and clarity in their communication. And they tend to write things as propositions. When they get to the real heart of their argument, they will often number their points and and propositions. And they say, well, point 3 follows from point 2, intrinsically. Point 5 is only true if either 1 or 2 must be correct. And it's a kind of basic propositional logic that you learn as a basic language in philosophical training. And this is immensely helpful because, and it's what I urge entrepreneurs to do a lot, is to take your own beliefs about the market, your own diagnosis of the market, and your own intentions, and to write them as propositions in the simplest form, unadorned with marketing or self-promotion, and then you can interrogate the causality, the actual logical relationships between them. And I think a lot of businesses, a lot of startups would enhance their chances of success if they were to do that.
I deeply relate to this because when I was on the founding team of a company with Lonsdale, it was also a very big founding team like you guys. I was 21. I was a senior in college. The average age was like 40. And the biggest value add I think I had during my 3-4 year tenure was simply during leadership meetings doing that exact exercise, which is you say A, which implies B. You say C, which implies not B.
Yes.
And me, as a 21-year-old, I have no idea whether A, B, or C about the market are true or false.
Yes.
But I know that A and C, if we have both A and C in the company strategy, this thing's not going to work. It's simply just this internal coherency was enough to actually help the teams kind of straighten out our thinking.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's exactly it. It's a kind of basic propositional logic and inferential coherence that you learn in philosophy. And even I've been witness to it many times, even very successful, multi-billion-dollar companies that are incoherent at this level, that that if you were to lay it out, you would say this argument is invalid.
Right.
I don't even know the market in question. I just know that this sequence of reasoning is invalid.
Right. And this is a superpower in some sense, because you can add value as an investor or as a team member without market knowledge, right? Because it's completely internal to the argument itself, right?
And it's the part of investing I like the most, by far. Actually, I like second most. The thing I like most is just the interaction at an emotional level with founders, because there's a kind of deep universality to that experience. The second thing I like, though, is this kind of very collaborative cross-examination. You could call it Socratic, you could call it cross-examination, where you're just asking, so if I've heard you correctly, you've said proposition one, did I get that right? And then two, and you're saying that one is axiomatic, two is contingent, but you think you have good evidence for it. And if both of these are true, that's why hence this. What would be contrary evidence to that? And this kind of questioning, done not patronizing, not like a professor,
right,
but just as an investor trying to understand what they're doing, I find is deeply appreciated. If it's done respectfully and often yields, even in a first conversation, even in that first half-hour introductory
yields
meeting,
insights for them, right?
It did. And for me, it's a profound reward when at the end of that first meeting they say, this conversation is different than the kinds I've had with other investors.
Right. I'm glad you like cross-examination, because I'll be cross-examining the things you've said over the past 10 years to see whether Marcus is coherent. Yeah,
I welcome it.
Let me give you a quote to highlight another aspect of the strategy, not just the internal logical coherence, but something else that's quite incredible. Okay, this is you speaking. Before we built anything, we had already conceived a product. We called it the binder, and it basically defined the company's product strategy for the next decade. It was a theory of what needs to be built and the sequence thereof. What was the MVP? What were the nice-to-haves? Where we would have to satisfy existing requirements, where we could build something 10x better, and it was extremely precisely and lucidly captured in a document that we then built and defined the company's strategy for a long time. Here, right, is another dimension of the strategic thinking, in addition to the logic, which is to almost have like a conception of the world or conception of the thing, the form, the Platonic form, that you then actualize in the world, which is also very unique in company building.
Yeah, it's not quite that grand, but yes. So that binder was written by my co-founder with the benefit of no knowledge whatsoever of the market that we were serving, just through patient cross-examination, very respectful from the people that would talk to us. He composed a theory of what would be the right product. And it was like any good theory, it was rigorously tested. It was iterated many times and it was adapted and so forth.
In the realm of thought.
In the realm of thought, but also just kind of counterfactual reasoning. It would say, well, should it be this? And then they said, why wouldn't that work? And what would be deficient about this? And I'm like, let me show you what that could look like. This kind of iteration with people who are actual practitioners. And these were all people, by the way, who, they were all capable, great professionals, whatever, but they would have been incapable of describing this product themselves. They could not have. It was his genius to extract from them their domain understanding to actually build and iterate a product. And then to put it in a document, that was actually other engineers who were also innocent of the domain could build the right product. And to then come up with a concept of a product that ended up being so resilient that it sustained a company to market leadership over dozens of competitors over 2 decades is, I think, a rarer achievement than it should be. That design work that happened in the earliest days, we were penniless, we had no funding, and was done just through kind of humble, respectful interviews with people in the domain who were doing it just out of joy of telling us, of someone being interested in their opinion, incidentally. We gave some of them stock, and they had no expectation of it being worth anything, and then when they found, $250,000 that they didn't expect, it was such a joyful moment for me. I take such delight in the fact that there were people who gave their time with no expectation of return, and then a decade later, or more than a decade later, found a really meaningful outcome for themselves.
So I really enjoyed reading and listening to all of your talks when you described this theory, this binder, because it showed me that I'm not crazy. Because I, at least on the founding team, was that person who was like, okay, let's try to progress in thought as much as we can, while recognizing the limitations of thought before we actually do things.
Yes.
Because the speed, the velocity of thinking and testing counterfactual and doing interviews is a lot greater than building a product and testing and finding out it doesn't work.
That's right.
Again, this is not the prevailing intuition, I think, today of building companies.
No.
In fact, a kind of hyperactivity is kind of almost worshipped, if not deemed necessary. Right? So tell us about that.
Well, the extremes are disastrous. You cannot build a product. You cannot build anything in pure isolation in thought, right? I mean, unless you're writing a work of philosophy, you need to engage the world. But just frenzied activity, that's not well directed, is also the surface area is too large. The set of possible products is too vast. There's too many parameters. So you have to condition the search. You have to shape it in some way.
So there are the two potential answers one can give to the question I just asked. The one you just gave seems to be, there's a golden mean.
Yes.
There's a golden mean between thinking and activity. And your point is, most people think that the diminishing returns come a lot earlier than they actually do of thinking. There's a lot more to be done in thinking.
Well put, yeah.
There's another way to answer my question, which is the one I thought you were going to say, which is that for nerds like you and me, this is the right path. But for some kind of hustler guy, you just, and there it's more about what approach suits you. Yeah.
Well, one of the humbling things about the journey for me is realizing there are different models of success.
Right.
There are different ways. For example, there are companies that are led by one charismatic, messianic figure who takes the team to the promised land, and who just knows the way, and who makes all the decisions, has a concept of the product, and through sheer force of will wins the early customers, and so it unfolds. That is a model of success. That was not our model of success. Our model of success was radically collegial, very rationalist, and a person who came from that former model, who tried to come into the company, would have been a disaster. It would be like, who is this clown?
And vice versa.
And vice versa. Because to be a rationalist while the Messiah was preaching would be like
a heretic. Yeah,
heretic. You're a heretic. Exactly. Or like, you should be getting in line. What's this alternate exercise, right? So there are different forms of organization, different paradigms and I acknowledge that. But for us, and I believe many of the companies that I admire most, and that I think have been the most durable, they had this kind of quality, this kind of hyper-rational, extremely customer-oriented, but also deeply opinionated theory about like what the best product ought to be. You could pick HP, you could pick IBM, or companies that were so visionary and compounded such value over such a long period of time in such a consistent and characteristic way, right? And then lost their way, right? But during those periods where they were that successful, they were animated by this kind of, in my opinion, this kind of product theory, right? This kind of care about what a product should be, and then iterating on it with rigor so that to the last decimal point it was actually worked.
So your first response is to retreat a bit and to say that it is a personality dependent kind of thing.
Yes.
But then you also want to gain back some ground by saying, but even though you can build good companies in this messianic way, this rational way is more sustainable, more long-lasting, or
perhaps the best thing to say is it's the only way that I understand. And I mean, I'm personally mystified. So let's say any company associated with Elon Musk is
messianic.
Is messianic by definition. He embodies 95% of the enterprise value in his opinion, and I don't understand it. So rather than criticize it, I can just say, I can just report incomprehension.
Right. This is the Wittgensteinian silence.
Right. It works in a fashion that I do not understand.
So I was going to cross-examine your desire to cross-examine.
Okay, sure.
But by pointing out the very thing you said, which is there are multi-billion-dollar companies that are not coherent at all.
That's right.
Right. And but this is just another way to point out that there is another mode of success that is almost like indecipherable to you.
Yes, it's right.
Let me give you another quote for you. One of the many illusions that my entrepreneurial journey cured me of was thinking that I was such a great judge of character. We all think we're such good judges of character, and then we find that we actually make terrible mistakes all the time. I was surprised that this wasn't one of your strengths, because when I talk to people like us, who philosophy, then went into industry, the most consistent answer isn't this kind of logical analysis that we've been describing. It's the ability to see in people's souls, like to make really quick and like very strong and opinionated judgments on people. But you didn't get that from philosophy.
No. I've certainly made too many mistakes to possibly ascribe that kind of power to myself. But I don't ascribe it to almost anyone else either.
Right.
Because we are deception machines. I mean, we're evolved to be very persuasive to each other and very good at obscuring our actual motivations, and there's enormously strong evolutionary pressures to be good at that. And I think it's sheer hubris to think that one bit of evidence, to my point of view here, is if you ask serious entrepreneurs, people, or serious executives who've managed a lot of people, have hired a lot of people, gone through many years, and said, what's your actual success rate? If we were actually to count the people that you hired to report to you, how many fulfilled or exceeded your expectations, and a year later you were thrilled with them? What percentage? You will very rarely hear something higher than 50%. Half the time, they hired people who turned out, and that's, my track record was probably, I don't know, 40 to 50%, something like that.
Right.
And it's just kind of, anyone who says higher, I've been in groups where founders have talked about this, and someone said, I don't know, about 70 or 80%, and everyone said, yeah, right. Really? And when they actually thought about it, no, you're right. It's more like 50%.
So your defense or excuse is something like, I'm bad at it, yes. So is everyone else.
So is everyone else.
But did philosophy make you better at it?
Actually, it made me worse. And the reason, and I'll say it made me worse in this specific way, because it preconditioned me to like a certain kind of persona, a certain kind of person. It exposed me to being deceived, let's say, by people who were charming interlocutors, for people who had, scintillating intellects, people who had diverse interests. And I would over-index on those kinds of people. I would say, this guy's great. He's an intellectual peer. He's going to be a thought partner. It's going to be great. Right. And it turns out that that's a very small part. It may even be an anti-pattern for being a good person.
A good operator.
A good operator, especially in an early stage in a company.
Wow.
And I, after making several serious mistakes on that count, I came to recognize there's a whole other set of traits that have mattered most. Look at the people. Now let's look objectively, empirically. Who has made the biggest difference in this company together? There's my co-founders, of course, but who has made the biggest difference? And they were not the ones that had went to the best schools. They were not the ones that were intellectual in the way that I would have defined it. They were the people who were the most loyal. They were the people who had the strongest work ethic. They were the people who were most reliable and highest integrity, and the ones that had the deepest sense of personal accountability to fulfilling their role.
Well, those traits aren't in tension with intellectual ability,
no.
Right?
It's orthogonal.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. So is it better to have the intellectual plus that?
That's glorious if you do. But it's like you're fishing for the wrong thing.
Right.
And then
your priorities wrong. You got the ordering wrong.
Right. Yeah. And then you're just lucky. Maybe you'll get lucky, as indeed we did. There were people who had it all. But we were searching for the wrong criteria, or I was.
What were the other ways that your training in philosophy actively disadvantaged you, that you had to unlearn when building the company?
One of those was the communication, applying a Kantian principle of reciprocity. Let me treat others exactly as I would like to be treated. So let me communicate to people the way that I would like to be communicated to. And that would, so I want to understand the whole logic. I want it inductively explained to me. What are the premises, and how do the conclusions therefore follow? And so that's how I shall communicate to people. It takes time, though. It takes a lot of words. It takes, diagrams, a lot of slides, a lot of connective logic in order to explain things in this way. And I was fairly deep into my tenure, during my time as CEO, where I would give, I would talk to the company in meetings, and I would have a kind of almost long, thesis statement about where we were and why we were deciding the things we were. And I thought this is what people wanted to hear, and it turned out not to be at all. But there was a point kind of late in my tenure when I realized that people didn't want the long, deeply inductive and explained, elaborated explanation of what we were doing. That I was completely missing the mark on what the team wanted to hear. What they wanted was the following. They wanted clarity, they wanted concision, and they wanted repetition. They wanted to know, there's Marcus, he is saying the same thing he said last quarter. And the quarter before that, and the quarter before that. And he said, we're going to have these ambitions, and we've met those ambitions, and we now have bigger ambitions, but it's in the same framework, and he is reiterating the same comforting truths that define this company and our strategy. That's what they wanted to hear. They didn't need all the the initial first principles elaboration of that. They already bought that. That's why they were there. They already believed it. Still in that same vein, I used to communicate in far too cerebral a fashion. I had a weird tick, which was kind of the more nervous I would get, the more socially awkward I would get, sort of the more elevated my diction would get. And I was talking like an Oxford Don sometimes by the time in a sales meeting, because I was so uncomfortable in the situation. And to a degree that I was conscious was preposterous. And I was using more.
You couldn't stop. Yeah.
I just couldn't stop. I mean, I did correct that habit later, but and it was a kind of a character trait that you can learn in the academic world sometimes, that when you're insecure, then you kind of retreat to,
you start developing a posh British accent.
Yes, you retreat to obfuscation or something, and that's not a good trait even in the academic world, of course.
So tell us about that transition.
Until my mid-20s, I was absolutely certain that my destiny was in the academy, that I would be a professional philosopher or maybe a literary critic. I was a very serious student my entire life. I was better at school than I was at anything else. That may still be true. But I suffered a crisis of anxiety that the academy might not have a home for me. And
because you weren't good enough, or
perhaps the world would be unfair. I don't know. I didn't know, but I felt I was getting a very adverse signal from all these other young academics early in their career who were racked with anxiety that they wouldn't have a home themselves. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have the hubris to say, but I'm different than they. I'm vastly superior. And actually, the sentiment I had was, I've been running the wrong race my whole life, and the world operates according to a completely different schema than I had understood before, and I have to now change course very painfully. But time is short, and I've got to get onto it. And was recruited by McKinsey at a very vulnerable moment, and before I knew it, within a few years, I decided I was put on this earth to be a software entrepreneur. I started a company, and somehow 25 years passed. Many of the people that were in my BPhil program, that were in the BPhil at Oxford, now have distinguished philosophy careers. And so they would always say to me, how did you go astray? Like, you were more of this than we were at the time. And I don't have a good answer, but I have no regrets about the way it unfolded. It's a tragedy of our existence. We only get to run the tape once. But I was motivated by anxiety and by fear. That's truthful. And in fact, even on the entrepreneurial journey, sometimes I'm asked, what drove you, to spend decades trying to do something difficult and improbable and against the odds? Was it a quest for glory? And I always say it was not a quest for glory. There was no expectation of great success, but there was a terror of failure, and that was a very profound motivator throughout. And there were many joyful experiences. It was filled with meaning and purpose. But at the end of the day, the most intense motivator, the life force, the will to power, was much more one of anxiety about not succeeding.
Interesting, but you picked a notoriously difficult industry to build in. So if you're that afraid of failure, why did you choose the sort of an extremely difficult industry to build in?
In a word, ignorance. We were saved by ignorance. Had we any sense of the difficulty of the market that we had chosen, or just the entrepreneurial journey itself, especially at that time, we would not have embarked on the journey. And so it was, it's good sometimes that you have to lash yourself to the mast and not allow yourself to give to temptations of ending things prematurely. That you have to commit and go. And that's the character of the entrepreneurial journey, and perhaps of a well-lived life, that you make these kinds of commitments far before you have all of the criteria, to make a wise judgment.
A leap of faith, in some sense.
A leap of faith, indeed, yeah. And that's the character of life, and it's of a well-lived one that's not lived in terror and in retreat. You have to take those risks.
Well, hold on there, because you said that on one hand, a life lived in this way is one that is free from terror, and yet the previous statement you made was one that is fear-driven.
Indeed.
How do you reconcile these?
Yeah, I think both are true. I describe it as the subjective habitus of the entrepreneur. It's a kind of combination of exhilaration, exaltation on the one hand, and terror and despondency on the other. And that is one of the reasons why it's such a difficult place to inhabit for a sustained period of time. It's part of the loneliness of that journey, because you have moments of very, very high highs, very exhilarating senses of something improbable that we are making happen, and then also this crushing disappointment when you say even the next step, even to take one more step on this journey is too much to ask, is too improbable, and to be able to retain both of those at the same time is very taxing. In the same vein, I used to have there were long stretches where I had two thoughts simultaneously. One was, we must succeed. We must. I've poured my life, my career, my life force, my potential into the success of this company.
Sorry. Is that a descriptive or normative statement? That we are going to succeed, or we have to?
Somewhere in between. Somewhere in between. So we must We must because what else could happen, and we must because there is no, how terrible the alternative would be. And I would have that on the one hand. And on the other hand, I would say, but we're not going to. Like the rational part of me would say, if I underwrite the situation here, it's very negative. That as a dispassionate one, if I could exit this first-person perspective, I would say we are likely to fail. In fact, we're almost certainly going to fail. And then I would flip to the other side, the first-person perspective, to say, but we must succeed. There's no other alternative. And this kind of oscillation between we must succeed, but we're going to fail, but we must succeed, but we're going to fail, at the same time, it's enormously fatiguing. It's very, very difficult.
That's so interesting, because the way you described this fundamental tension between the third-person objective and the first-person subjective is almost like religious experience, right? Because if I'm a religious experience, even the believers, they themselves admit, like, if you you can't rationally get to God, at least, and not the Abrahamic God. But from the first-person perspective, something that might seem so mundane and innocuous can just pull you in a way that you can't possibly describe. And so it's almost a religious tension you're wrestling with.
So the difference between the first and the third-person perspective is kind of the taproot at a whole host of philosophical questions, including I think, in my opinion, the deepest, the most unfathomable question of all, which is, how does a mind and subjectivity exist in a material world? It's the deepest of all mysteries, right? But that is also a switch between the first and third person perspectives all the time. I inhabit the world in a particular place. I am situated at a particular locus, and I have a set of experiences that are distinctly and maybe even privately mine, but at the same time, I am an observable, embodied creature at the same time. And in a way, and I see much of the kind of entrepreneurial journey through this philosophical lens, and that's the theme of our conversation, you have that as well as an entrepreneur. You have this first-person drive, which is, I can only succeed, and you have this third-person reality, which is that the world is indifferent, and we could fail, and we probably will.
So here you are making an even more interesting claim that your condition is generalizable.
I think so.
Because I was going to say, you thought your disposition towards the terror and the fear was quite unusual. Is that right?
As I've gotten to meet more entrepreneurs over the years, I've recognized a kind of deep universality to it. Now, there's a subset of entrepreneurs, I don't know if they're sociopaths, that sounds too judgmental, but who somehow are kind of inoculated, they're inured against this kind of...
They only have the first person,
They only have the first person. They're just not... They don't suffer from self-doubt. We all know these people.
Right.
And I don't know if it's a blessing or curse to be that way, but it's something fundamental in a person's character.
Well, empirically, do they work out or do they not work out?
I think we know some spectacular successes, and for whom that was a critical ingredient. Just the complete absence of self-doubt, no matter how outrageous their claims.
And you believe them, You don't think they're kind of like putting on a show to others?
I don't think so. I know a few of these people, and I think it becomes maybe they get a powerful feedback signal that people are just swayed by their conviction. And, and we lionize some of these people, this reality distortion field, that some of the most charismatic founders or leaders have. But it's a fine line between that and a kind of sociopathy, right? Like where you're just kind of indifferent to the world. You're indifferent to the presence of other minds and their needs. And I don't want to be that kind of person. I am not that kind of person. And most people are not like that. And we have to be careful not to be dazzled by people that way, because it's very dangerous and they can lead to very bad places. Historians have a very ambivalent attitude towards these great people. I mean, like a Pericles or a Napoleon, or who just kind of, they are the agents of history. They move things forward, but at the same time they can be the agents of just tremendous suffering and disaster. One of the beautiful comforts of reading Hegel or thinking about him and his worldview was that that sometimes that you would have these agents of history that might do terrible things, but they were always in the service of a larger unfolding, of something eventually becoming better, a trajectory towards something that was more enlightened, however dark the path might have been to get there. And that's a very helpful comfort in the darkest moments. I used to philosophize aspects of the entrepreneurial journey a lot, and I thought back to those days of reading Hegel and our own journey, and I would think about the moments of devastating failure, but then also say, well, this is going to be metabolized. It's going to be reinvented into something that will be a source of strength in our future. And that was a great comfort to me. And where our product didn't work at first and we had to disappoint customers, or we had a rupture with our investors and they imposed a new CEO on us that was a disaster. or we were sued by our primary competitor, and who nearly put us out of business. So each of these were devastating events that really that put the company on the knife edge of just being game over. And each of them, because we survived stronger. And and that's a truism. The things that don't kill you, fortify you. But I got to live that in a particularly intense form.
Well, what's quite different between Hegelian philosophy and what you just described is that there's a necessity in Hegel.
That's right.
Which doesn't exist in these examples. Like you could very easily see how like your competitor, Accenture in this case, could have just sued you out of business, and there was no sublation to a higher state.
But a key part of Hegel is that you don't know. It's like the participants in history. First of all, they're expendable, but secondly, they're not aware of what happens. Like the most famous line of all is the owl of Minerva only takes flight at dusk. It's only at the end that you get to piece together the narrative that you've been part of. But while you're in the middle, you have no idea, and maybe you'll disappear without a trace.
It's like Dung, who was asked what he thought of the French Revolution, and he's like, too early to tell.
Too early to tell. It's still unfolding.
Right. So tell us about what you most cherished about the entrepreneurial path that you wouldn't have gotten in the academic path. And vice versa, what do you regret most, or what do you miss most about the academic path that you didn't get on the entrepreneurial path?
It tested me. It tested me in an extreme way, a way that, to really, I realized I had taken a much greater risk than I realized. Not with my life, but with my career, with my aspirations, with my self-conception as a successful person, or a person of high potential.
Leaving the academy, you mean?
That's right.
Leaving the academy.
That's right. And I had put that all on the table and was now gambling with it in a way that was very frightening at times. And different people are not encumbered with that same sense of needing to succeed. But when you're a first generation immigrant kid and you are the hope of your generation, and your parents have labored and sacrificed to give you the best education, and you now realize that you may come to nothing, it weighs very, very painfully, right? And so to be tested in that state and to not have just done the cautious thing that I could have done along the way and to have come out the other side of it was let's call it the defining experience of my life. The other great thing it gave me was it compelled me to interact with people who are not like me. So if you encountered me at 25 and you had read some of the same books and had the same kind of intellectual disposition and the same kind of cerebral self-seriousness that I did, well, I would talk with you all night.
Right. I'm sure we would have gotten along fine.
We would have been fast friends, and we would have talked infinitely. But if you came from a different part of the country, if you had a different relationship to religion, if you enjoyed different activities, then I would be at a loss. In the first 30 seconds, I wouldn't know what to say, because I would say we've exhausted our common ground, and you can't afford that. When you are an entrepreneur, you must find a way to meet your market, first of all, on its own terms. You have to speak to it in ways that are not condescending. You have to bring a humility, and you have to be prepared fundamentally to learn from the people that you're speaking to, even if they look completely different than you. And compelling me to adapt to that over and over again in ways that were intensely uncomfortable and unnatural to me over a sustained time, no question made me a better person. No question.
Better in what dimension?
More empathetic, more self-aware, more compassionate of people who had different life experiences, and just more capable. As opposed to being paralyzed in situations that were not perfectly crafted to my form of communication, now to be fine in any setting. Especially growing up as a minority, extremely cerebral and introverted, that was a profound gift. To be able to do that.
Hegel's philosophy of right, he gives a defense of the market economy, that it has an educational role and it has a formative role. Because precisely as he says, the market forces you to interface with the wider world.
Yes.
And in your case, this was a global world. Guidewire, your company, eventually became not just with global customers, but also global employees. Yeah.
That's right. With employees, but just different parts of the world and people who had completely different life experiences. And it's one of the tragedies or one of the great risks of our modern era right now, that it's possible to sequester yourself with only people who already agree with you. And that's That's a profound. This is an experiment that we don't know how we're in uncharted waters.
It's the reverse of the effect of the market that Hegel wanted, right? Where the market forces you to interact with all kinds of different people.
That's right.
Because they're paying money, they're customers.
That's right.
Now we're living in a, for example, social media environment where you're kind of just in an echo chamber.
You can be exactly, and that's it's uncharted waters. Exactly where that leads, but so far the indications are not good.
Right. So what about the reverse? What do you perhaps regret, or what would you have liked to experience in the academic path?
The thing I miss most is a certain kind of depth of contemplation, right? You're always on the clock when you are in the world of commerce. There's an understanding that in the academic world that serious thinking takes serious time, and it's incremental. That you are a participant in a vast river of human thought and achievement and contemplation, and your goal is maybe to add the tiniest bit of sediment, one pebble, onto this vast edifice of human understanding, and even that will take time. And that basic understanding you're not afforded in the entrepreneurial world. But I miss being able to read for very long stretches, and the kind of deep immersive reading or deep immersive conversation and so forth. And actually, I discovered during the COVID years that I had really lost the faculty. I just couldn't. I'd always thought of myself as as a great reader. I love to read, and I realized I've read very little in this last 15 years. And let me rectify that now that I have time. And I found it disturbingly difficult. I found it very hard to read serious works. And fortunately, it came back, but not before a good 3 or 4 months of kind of struggle. It was like being very out of shape to learn just to read again properly.
So that was also kind of my big issue with the startup life, which is why, much earlier than you, I decided to go back to contemplation. The way I describe it is that if you were to rank the difficulty or profundity of decisions, right? Let's say, math is 99, philosophy is 97, physics is 98, and then, art history is like a 60. For me, a lot of entrepreneurship is just solving a lot of level 40 questions, to a reasonable enough accuracy over and over and over and over again. Yeah. And that was just a kind of a mental tedium that I could not stand.
Well, a lot of life is tedious that way. A lot of most ordinary jobs have that quality. I mean, the redeeming aspect and the exhilarating aspect of entrepreneurship is that you get to do it on your own terms as the owner, on the vector of your own decision. But yes, that's fundamentally different. On the other hand, there's a kind of academic or intellectual despair as well, which is, how can I possibly contribute to this vast edifice? I can't even find a grain of sand to add to this huge pyramid, and that's a different kind of despair.
I see. Did you continue to engage with philosophy at all after you left the academy?
Very little professional philosophy, sort of like serious academic journals. I did not read so much, but I would read philosophical works, and I still do. They tend to be a little bit more written for the amateur than the kind of hardcore professional philosopher. But even then, I read some pretty heavyweight philosophical texts, especially in the last few years where the workload has not been as demanding. I don't know if I would have ever made it as a great professional philosopher. I liked that tribe of people. I liked people who were capable, whose minds had that kind of facility that we could talk with great precision over long, extended periods of time. And I've not had that since then, and I miss that. But it's very hard to replicate that now once you're outside of the academic world. And there's a kind of loneliness to reading those texts, because a lot of the joy of it would be to engage with another person, either the person who wrote it or the people who were talking about it. And I don't really have that today.
I see. What is the fact that you stopped engaging with philosophy after you left? Tell us about your original motivation in engaging with it. The difference between you and I was, the reason I left the entrepreneurial world in 4 years instead of 20, 25 was because I couldn't stop reading philosophy. I would find myself 11 p.m. after work when I was done the day, just grabbing up Augustine or something like that. And I suspect the answer is because I came into philosophy as a practical thing. I wanted to figure out, my most urgent questions are all around ethics and how I should live, where perhaps, and I'm speculating, you treated philosophy as a competition, as a glory, and there, right, you simply just turned your gladiatorial ring into another arena. I
think that's very insightful. I think that's actually largely true. I was better at school than I was at anything else. And, especially when you're a minority kid, you're socially awkward, you're introverted, just like anyone, you say, what can I attach to? What can be my source of confidence? What is my source of power in this world? And for me, it was a kind of intellectual facility that I had, ability to read far beyond my age level when I was a kid, just ability to be showered by praise, by teachers, along the way, to have a very prestigious education. And these things were a comfort that showed in this difficult and sometimes unfriendly world, there is a meritocratic path where I am excelling. And it happened to be, humanities, it happened to be including philosophy. So you're right, it was a kind of professional domain. And I was able to then change, with difficulty and with a lot of stress, was able to change that, redirect, recathect, you might say, that kind of life force, ambition and energy towards something else. But it came at a price, and that attachment in the beginning was not totally arbitrary. Right. It's not like my father, cracked a whip and said, "I'm going to play the violin." I was naturally cerebral in that way. I liked to read, to inquire, and I like to press points, far beyond the kind of comfortable level that where kids eventually encounter so much resistance that they just that they stop. And I retain that today, and I'm grateful for it.
In my own case, at least, I found my journey a lot more brief into the active life, so to speak, quite helpful for my philosophical interests and endeavors now. It adds a sort of weight. I think Plato recommended young men and women not to do philosophy before they're 30, because the young mind to him does not have the kind of practical wisdom to know which ideas are worth pursuing and which ideas aren't. Do you think you're a greater philosopher in any sense of the word after going through Guidewire?
I've had occasion to reread things that I had read, when I was younger, and they have a deeper resonance to me because, having encountered the world or wrestled with the world, so to speak. Albert Hirschman, he wrote this book called Reason, Voice, and Loyalty, or Loyalty, Voice, and Reason. I can't remember which. But it's actually more a work of like organizational psychology. I had read it when I was, a jejune 18-year-old, and what did I know? I'd never been part of any organization. I'd just been a student my whole life. And now, decades later, I had run an organization that had 3,500 employees, and it had a completely different character to me. One of my favorite, it's not even philosophy, it's a preface to philosophy in Philosophical Explanations by Robert Nozick. So he talks about his own journey as a philosopher, and how there was a point when he thought the purpose of philosophy was to make arguments so powerful, just so irresistible, that if you didn't accept them, then you were knocked dead. Like there was something, your brain would malfunction because you had accepted, A and not A at the same time, right? And that was the goal, to make arguments that strong, right? And, I had read that when I was an undergrad, and I said, he was talking about how he evolved from that perspective, but that was such an exhilarating idea. And that's kind of how I thought about.
Right, it's a gladiatorial combat. You knock them dead, yeah.
Exactly, with arguments, and cross-examination was a big part of that. You highlight their inconsistency, their incoherence. And, as you get older and you realize that you never really persuade anybody of anything. Not only do you knock them dead, you don't even change their minds. Right. And I try to think, have I ever, in all my years of discussions with people, have I ever really changed someone's mind?
Yeah.
And I realized probably not. I don't know. I can't think of any.
I'm not even sure that's how philosophers work.
I don't think it's either. I don't know. So anyway, I think the beauty of a relationship with a written word is that you get to re-encounter, you get to return to something, and it has an echo, it has a reverberation that kind of brings you back into a re-encounter with your younger self, your younger mind, and it brings a kind of self-knowledge. And if you don't have a relationship with a written word, you don't get that. You don't have that chance to experience that reverberation, that inner voice, so to speak. And again, what a profound gift to have had the education I had.
That's so interesting. It's almost, for you to have read certain important books when you were young,
that's right,
is to have your own soul to be deposited there.
That's right.
And then when you pick it up again when you're old, you're encountering not just the book, but yourself.
Yes. In fact, we were talking about Hegel. I actually recently picked up the Phenomenology of Spirit again, which I read as an undergrad. I mean, it's a punishingly difficult book. If you don't, I don't know if...
The writing doesn't help.
Oh my God, it's incredibly hard and obscure and weird book to read. And I found it myself able to read it very fluently now.
Wow.
I was like, it actually, things that had seemed so difficult and dense, and I was so pleased by that, but it showed that it had been kind of an unlock, that somehow my life experiences had unlocked things that had been obscure before.
What I find most remarkable about your transition was not just the skills you had to relearn, but the type of character, like how different the hyper-tracked academic is from the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, right? You have like thinking versus action, you have the bureaucratic versus the highly agential. You kind of have like the absent-minded, like slow thinking and the hyper-quick and practical. You have the patient versus the urgent. So what enabled your character to succeed in both these domains that requires polar opposite traits?
Yeah. Well, I think the universal, if I had one, and this sounds too flattering to myself, but it was just ambition. Like, I need to succeed.
That was the core. And so you were willing to transform all the other parts of yourself to fit.
That's right. It was the necessity. It was the power of necessity. And again, I have such a gratitude for this. I think a life spent that never encounters the edge of necessity, the edge of potentially catastrophic failure, a sense that you've made serious promises to people, that you've pledged your honor to something succeeding, that you've invested, you've injected it with your identity, even to say, I am an entrepreneur, I am the founder of this company, and if it fails, then I have failed. I am the failure in some way. Like, to have lived a life without having done that is somehow a little bit lesser in my mind. I don't mean morally lesser.
Yeah.
I just mean
less full or something.
Like less full. A little, like it hasn't seen or done something that's very important.
When you gain the traits of the entrepreneur, it sounds like, for example, at least for deep thinking, you kind of lose. It's not a Hegelian gain.
Yeah.
It's not like you're able to subsume both under you.
No.
It was a switch.
It's a switch. It's a switch, yes. And you have to cut off your reasoning, shorter. You don't get to write a long inductive argument for why we ought to go east instead of west. No, you have to act. You have to have a predisposition to act. You have to get on the plane. You have to sell that customer. And I'm just grateful to have had a life that had both of these. That had both.
Right.
That had more time for contemplation than most people have had, and then a life, characterized by very intense action. And I hope in this chapter, maybe something that's a little bit more
so
balanced.
maybe there is a Hegelian conclusion to this, right?
Maybe
Where
so.
you were just philosopher, you were just king, and now maybe you're able to combine these aspects.
That's a very flattering way to put what I aspire to do now. I mean, I'm a venture capitalist, and it's important to generate good returns, and I'm just as ambitious. So I have the same ambition to do this job well. But the way in which I want to do it well, I think, is by unlocking for a certain set of founders their best selves, their best capacities, and that's by being their ally. That is by asking the right kind of provocations, but in a way that's helping their reasoning process to come to a conclusion. And maybe that's too grandiose, but that's my aspiration, and to live a bit vicariously through other people going through what I went through.
So this is another quote from you to describe why you weren't content at McKinsey. I was resistant to having a boss and had unreasonable confidence in my own ideas. What this reminded me of was kind of the difference between the thinker and the scholar. I think what the thinker is to the scholar, the founder is to the employee, in the sense that the former, the thinker and the founder, they're kind of mavericks. And if you judge them on the basis of an employee or a scholar, they're actually quite bad.
Yes.
Like Nietzsche's a pretty terrible scholar, at least in his later works. I mean, he had a great early scholarly career.
Yes, a philologist, yes.
But it was precisely because his willingness to ignore those scholarly conventions that made him a great thinker.
Yeah.
And so my question for you is, clearly in this founder-employee path, you chose the founder path. Do you think, had you gone down the academic path, would you have kept that kind of maverick tendency?
I think so.
And become a thinker instead of a scholar?
Yeah, I think in my own psychological self-diagnosis, I had a unreasonable, unwarranted expectation that I should be in charge, that my ideas were better, that I couldn't bear to work. And I think I inherited this from my father, by the way. He was a professor himself. He was a sociologist, not a philosopher. But he struggled with department chairs and university administration and so forth, because he was always exasperated by that. But yes, I chafed all the time at the idea that someone would tell me. Not that I knew the right answer. I just didn't want to do it on someone else's terms.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do it at their behest. I didn't want my contribution to make that person more glorious. And, the best employees are ones, I've read this somewhere, they're the ones that internalize their superior, their boss's objectives, and as their own.
Yeah.
But I couldn't do that. I was just incapable of it.
Yeah.
And that, maybe more than anything else, drove me to the entrepreneurial path. That's why, again, the subtitle of the book that I have yet to write is, a founder is not an employee, and a startup is not a company.
Of course, a thinker is not a scholar. A thinker is not a scholar. Yeah.
Exactly. A startup is a company, but I'm saying it's not a company. Like, none of the other conventions or characteristics of a company apply to a true startup.
Right.
Of course, the founder is an employee. He's paid a salary, etc.
Right.
But he's not an employee in that constitutive sense.
Or even more strongly, the same things that would make one a good employee would make them a bad founder.
Precisely.
Same thing with the thinker and the scholar. Okay.
So
you described your unreasonable confidence.
Yes.
And I'm going to cross-examine you. Because you also described your kind of perpetual insecurity. Here's another quote. I have a hole inside of me that can't be filled. The founders that I am personally drawn to as an investor are also perpetually insecure.
Yes.
2 questions. Number 1, why are you perpetually insecure? And number 2, how do you reconcile that with your, unreasonable confidence?
Well, I think anyone who has a kind of self-awareness, anyone who has a knowledge of what's preceded him, should have an insecurity. When you consider the vastness of this world, the vastness of human achievement, and the accomplishments, just forget just in the commercial world, not to speak of the academic or the philosophical world, it takes incredible temerity to say, I'm going to move the earth here. I'm going to add something that's genuinely novel. Philosophy is particularly humbling in this way. I imagine that mathematics would be something similar like this, where, there's this vast edifice of achievement that has been so polished by so many generations of contemplation. It takes what kind of audacity it takes to say, I will observe something that no one else has noticed. Anyone who doesn't approach that with insecurity is just ignorant, right? On the other hand, there is a kind of confidence in that comes from looking around and saying, look at others who are doing this, and look at the kind of the rashness, the recklessness, the inconsiderate, the incoherent way in which they're approaching this problem. Surely we can do better. And I would say we had both of those attributes in, us as a founding team. On the one hand, we said, we actually recited this almost like a mantra. This company's never going public, right? None of us are going to become billionaires out of this thing. We'll never be a household name. No one's going to know it. We're just going to try to build software like a craft and make our customers successful and build something of value. And how that monetizes and how we're rewarded for it, that's a subject for another day, right? So we brought that kind of humility to it. At the same time, we did bring a kind of swagger, because we said, look at these clowns who have started the companies that we used to work at. Look at all these other would-be entrepreneurs. Look how wasteful they are. Look how shallow their reasoning is, right? And surely we're going to do better. So we had both.
I think there's actually a corollary in philosophy as well. On one hand, you stand next to these giants, you're like, hey. But on the other hand, even some of the greats have the most simple of errors,
of course,
in their arguments. And so that on one hand is almost a generation of insecurity, but also an invitation to join their ranks. Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, even the greatest philosophical works, there are these moments
ridiculous,
just absurd. I mean, even in Kant, there are parts that are like, this is. It's a joke. I mean, you should not tell a lie even to prevent a murderer from coming and killing your friend, because that would be somehow self-contradictory. And you said, how could anybody possibly, who claims to be a moral philosopher, come to that conclusion, let alone one of the greatest moral philosophers of all time? It's just so idiotic. So you're right. You have to actually treasure those moments, because they suggest we're all fallible.
Or it's an invitation.
Yes.
So did your successes at Guidewire fill this hole?
It's a good question. I'd say yes and no. So on the one hand, yes, it satisfied something that it was so improbable that we would succeed, and we had, and in the most unmistakable terms. On the other hand, I'm deeply unsatisfied. The company should be much better than it is now. Because what happens? Your horizon opens. You achieve.
You see the next level.
You see the next summit. The next summit comes into view. And I recognize, the Guidewire today has $1.1 billion or $1.2 billion in revenue. That puts it in a pretty elite company. There are very few venture-backed companies that ever get to anything close to that scale. But it should be $5 billion. It can. It has that opportunity. I no longer lead the company, and that's a a source of sometimes some sadness to me. But I'm not fully satisfied. And if you are an ambitious person and you work in a place as intensely competitive as Silicon Valley and the venture ecosystem, you're around people who are at all levels of success, and it's like a fractal. There are people who are orders of magnitude more successful and orders of magnitude more successful than that. And so, if you are constituted as I am, right, and you spend time with people like that, then you cannot resist a kind of comparative tug, and a sense, I ought to have done more. I ought to be able to achieve more. I ought to have achieved more. And I guess I choose just to embrace that as a kind of life force, as opposed to, just a way to make myself unhappy all the time.
Right. But when you talk about if I don't do this, it's over, will I be a failure? Yes. Is that gone?
Indeed it is. Indeed it is, yes. And so the one thing I'm most grateful for. So success
works, apparently. Like external success work, contra the Stoics.
There's a moment in Marx, I guess it's like I think it's in the first or second volume of Capital, when he says the whole of human history is essentially the effort to wrest freedom from necessity, right? And even as our needs have expanded, there is still our needs expand, but they've not expanded to infinity, and we have to find freedom, and that requires a shortening of the working day, right? So he ultimately did ground this idea of what it is to be free, and like saying we need a certain amount of leisure, there's a certain foundational core that on top of which now we can start to be free creatures, but we're not just beasts of burden. And in a sense, I gotten to experience that. I've gotten to experience to kind of clear a certain threshold. We call it financial freedom. It's a place where life does not have a quality of just continuous necessity. And that transition, that's just a binary moment. I mean, it's not a specific moment in time, but it's a binary state of mind, is glorious. And there is nothing I could possibly consume. There is no pleasure, no food, no experience, no object I could possibly buy that would have anything like the reward as having crossed that threshold.
And sorry, just to be clear, do you mean having built a decacorn?
No.
Or do you mean having the money in your bank account that it gives you freedom from necessity?
It's the latter, but it is, having said, there is a kind of floor to the accomplishment that one unlocked the other. And as a result, I no longer, there is the kind of abyss of possible failure,
But if you had just won a lottery and had the money in bank account, that wouldn't do it,
of course
right?
Not. Of course not.
So it's both having, but also if you lost all that money, someone stole it all away, that would also...
Yeah, but it's like to have wrestled the world and succeeded to some measure that then, allowed a kind of liberation from the, basically, the kind of material constraints that I had grown up with and that my family had grown up in. There's no return from that. But that said...
There's a return, right, if you lose the money?
Yes, right, if I were to be reckless or extremely unlucky. But outside of that, ambition continues. It doesn't continue with quite the same... I would say the intensity is just as great. It doesn't have the same kind of desperate character,
right?
Fearful character.
Right. I mean, this is how I describe one of my changes, which is I went from trying to minimize the negative to pursuing the positive. Yeah. And that's a much better way to live.
Indeed,
right?
Indeed. It's, or as some say, like an austerity versus an abundance kind of mindset.
It's very interesting because many philosophical approaches to this kind of gaping hole inside of us is to want to sort of resolve the hole. Mm-hmm. But from what you just said, kind of filling the hole with like actual external achievements also work.
Indeed. Yeah, well, I mean, Nietzsche called it a will to power, and it meant it was never satisfied. The will to power there's not some moment where it's over.
But the character of it changes, is your point.
Yeah, the character of it changes, and it goes from being, the fearfulness of it disappeared. And for that, I'm profoundly grateful.
Yeah. We talked about the relationship between contemplation and action in your own life. Now I want to first just talk about contemplation, and then talk fully about Guidewire. So give us an overview of your early life and how you got into philosophy and eventually went to Princeton and Oxford.
So I was one of two kids. I grew up in Maryland. My parents were first generation Korean immigrants. And I wasn't a radical social misfit or anything, but I was much more inward looking, and I discovered, because my parents were very well educated and he was a professor, discovered the world of ideas perhaps earlier than most. There was a moment when I Well, during the breaks I had at university, I said I chose those as like extra time where I got to study more, I got to read more outside of without the pressure of a class. That's how serious a student I was, and I had this feeling as an undergrad that as you get exposed to the world of ideas and you see just how vast it is, just how much there is to read, right? I said I need to catch up. I need to ingest this canon. I had to be conversant in this corpus of books, and so. There was this opportunity at this one Harvard bookstore that was going out of business that it was a certain, if you had, under the right conditions, you could go and you could basically buy $500 worth of books for $200. And I took a bus and I, loaded up multiple duffel bags with all of these like canonical works. And I think back to that time with such amusement because how earnest I was. How earnest I felt like this was the most important thing in the world, was to read these books and to be a serious scholar. That's what it was going to take. And I love that young man that was so full of drive and earnestness at that point, even though he became someone else.
I see. So you described the experience of growing up as a minority, and for me, I spent most of my formative years in China, where I was not a minority. And then when I moved over here, I became a minority. And so for those first early years, if I'm being honest with myself, a lot of my motivation to do well, both in school as well as in my career, was a kind of, I wouldn't say frustrated romantic drive, but a desire to be better in that domain, to get like female attention.
Yes.
How much of your own early career drive, both in the academy as well as in tech, was due to that?
Well, I think being an Asian American male in that era was a very fraught experience. The cultural exemplars of that time were, when I say that time, I mean the 80s, let's say, or the 80s and 90s, were deeply emasculating, and were
the Asian exemplars.
And many different Asian American writers have talked about this to varying degrees with varying degrees of vulnerability, but that it is a kind of erasure. The experience is a kind of and one's romantic or sexual self it's constitutive of our character. You cannot forget it. You cannot choose to pretend it doesn't exist, right? And yet that was kind of characteristic of the experience, especially I speak as a male. I think there was a slightly different character to being a female during that. And I don't describe it as oppressive. It was just that was the particular moment in the particular cultural milieu in which I lived. And so there was a sense for me, and I think others like me, to say these kinds of this whole domain is only one of kind of frustration. It's only one of frustration and pain. So therefore, we have to cathect that drive into something into a deferral that will find its reward someplace else. It's maybe far in the future. And that ability to defer gratification, is a very, very powerful cultural trait, a very powerful character trait, if you don't take it to extremes. And I would say it's fair to say that this is probably true of my brother as well, we kind of and true of many others of our generation, really learned that, and learned a kind of deep deferral that arguably turned out to be an asset later in life.
Because it forced you to direct, you're like, I can't compete in this domain now.
That's right.
So I just have to
find another source of power. And that power, I'm not sure where it will be. And as we talked about through much of this conversation, it was, I'll excel in this institutional way.
Right.
But if it's not that, then I will excel then in the way that ultimately commands power, which is wealth, which is wealth and career success, right? And it's, we don't know ourselves. We're mysteries to ourselves. But when I say, where did the deepest drive come from? The moments, and I've described it to you earlier as a terror of failure. But why was it so terrifying to fail? Because
one of it was the romantic concerns.
That's right. And that you could say that was a kind of the second order question, or the next question would be, whence the terror, right? And it was a sense that everything was at stake.
Right.
Why was everything at stake? You could have gotten another job. I know, but I would have lost a certain quest for power.
One of my professors had, I think, one of the most interesting understandings of Rousseau on romance. So Rousseau believes that we have a desire to be the best. And obviously, not everyone can satisfy this desire to be the best by definition for everyone. We can't all be LeBron.
Mm-hmm.
However, Rousseau thinks one of the functions of marriage is to satisfy this desire by making you the best, at least for someone, if not everyone.
Yeah.
Because when you marry someone, or when you're in a monogamous relationship, you say, you are the best, at least for me right now.
Yes.
A corollary of this argument is that if you don't have the romantic intuition, you project that desire of being the best in another domain. That desire remains unsatisfied. And so there's a joke that I make, which is, I only like to invest in two types of founders, the single and the unhappily married. Because those are the ones who do not have that desire to be the best fulfilled yet. What do you think about that?
There is some truth to that. The desire for that kind of recognition, for romantic recognition, is an incredibly powerful force. I would not say it was the animating force for me.
It was not.
Well, I wouldn't say it was consciously. Marriage is one of the casualties of my entrepreneurial journey, and I suffered that as a real failure.
So you married before you started?
Almost exactly at the same time as I started, just by coincidence. The two started at the same moment, and then failed. It failed later, however, it has a very happy ending because I ended up meeting the love of my life, and she is now is a source of profound joy, and a kind of love that I didn't know was possible, and that's a gift that was completely unexpected at a stage in life when I did not believe in such things. So there's a possibility for wonder, no matter how experienced and worldly you may feel that you are, and I'm testament to that. But I think that starting a company is such a demanding journey that it is very difficult. It can't really compete with another kind of open-ended pursuit to find one's life partner. And I think if that's not utterly stable, if that I don't want to say anesthetized. I don't want to say anesthetized because it's something that's much more constructive than that. Then it makes it a very, very arduous journey, maybe hard to the point of impossibility.
Right,
I think.
Right. So in your case, unhappily married, so I would have invested in you.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, tell us about finding love at an age where you didn't believe in such things anymore.
Well, that's just serendipity. I mean, it's just, and there's no, it's just a mystery. There's no explanation.
It's ineffable. You can't.
It's inevitable.
Right.
That's right. I mean, she and I often describe it as, both of us are kind of atheist by nature and so forth, but found a kind of religion in loving each other.
That's beautiful. Princeton.
Yep.
You did a degree in philosophy and literature.
Yep.
On the literature side, you were exposed to postmodernism was the fad.
Yes.
And you described to me how today in our contemporary political environment, you're seeing a emergence of postmodernism, but not on the left, but on the right.
That's right.
So tell us about that.
Well, let's see. So when I was an undergraduate in let's say the early 90s, there was a sort of radical wave, intellectual wave, that now seems like ancient history, of kind of like postmodern thinking. And this is in humanities departments across, pretty much the whole country, and it was a set of thinkers like Jacques Derrida, Maurice Blanchot, or most importantly like a Michel Foucault, that suggested things are not as they seem. That the world is a text, and this text can be interpreted in ways that are radically different than the ways that the authors of those texts might have imagined them to be. That we can bring a kind of interpretive lens to life, to text, to the news, to history, that interprets it now on different dimensions of power, on dimensions of domination and hierarchy, that are radical, right? And I found these theories exhilarating when I was in college.
Because they're contrarian in nature, they're sort of ability to uncover things that are hidden.
That's right. It's a sense that you could rip a veil off of the world. To be steeped in postmodern theory, critical theory at that time, it felt like you had this weapon, this scalpel, with which you could interpret the world as a kind of like radical ninja interpreter. No text, no idea, no narrative was safe from your ability to penetrate within it and see new ideas. And it was a very, very exhilarating idea. Now, it led to some very crazy and incoherent places. The bizarre thing about this moment, as you alluded to our conversation about, is that the people who are saying the most, saying the most outrageous things, who are the most distrustful conspiracy theory-like deconstruction of the world as of the kind of coherent world that we know it, are now found on the right, right? And they are ones that say that even things that kind of sacred texts, like the Constitution, for example, actually mean something different than what we thought it meant, and ideas that were kind of considered completely beyond the pale ought to be like reintroduced into the mainstream and are worthy of serious consideration, and that there's a complete inversion of right, like the people that have been arguing on behalf of, let's say, greater diversity and equality are actually the true oppressors. And this kind of characteristic inversion of like who we thought were the good guys and the bad guys, that kind of flip and making textual arguments for that seems to be in the province of the right. And that to me is a fascinating, bewildering, and completely unexpected development.
My first foray into philosophy was a book called Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World by René Girard, Stanford professor. Mm-hmm. And as the title suggests, it's about uncovering things hidden since the foundation of the world. Mm-hmm. And there's something so appealing to a young man, I suppose.
Exactly.
Of like showing X to be not X.
Exactly.
Or something, right?
Exactly.
Because it gives you, as a young, perhaps powerless man, a sense of power.
That's right.
That I know. I hold the keys.
Exactly.
So,
for example, in Discipline and Punish, Foucault's most famous work, he says the school. What is a school? It looks like it's an institution for edification and for elevation. No, a school is an institution for domination,
right, for
oppression and for indoctrination, right? And when you're a young person, that idea is exhilarating. That as a rebellious teen somehow seems very true, right? And it gives you a kind of power to say, whatever you may tell me about the way the world really works,
I know this.
I can unlock it. Yeah. I can unlock it, and I have a set of tools to expose its hypocrisy, etc.
How did you grow out of that phase?
You realize the kind of pointlessness of that. So first of all, and this was part of my swerve away from the academic world, I think, was realizing the impotence and the kind of ultimately the pointlessness of these readings, these deconstructive readings, right? Like you could.
I see. You can just do them infinitely and nothing happens.
Exactly. Yeah. And the greatest of the postmodern thinkers at the time, Derrida himself, said, like, what is the point of theory? And at one point he said, it's like play. It's endless play. You just kind of dance from text to text, and you have these, observation, but there's no point of resolution. You don't arrive at any truth. You just dance and bounce, you ricochet off of that to make the next pithy observation, right? And you realize, wait a minute, does anyone actually care? Like you have these scintillating turns of expression and these kind of witty ripostes and so forth, but ultimately it's impotent, right?
Well, you described your turn away from postmodernism as the same move of your turning away from academy to industry. Yes. But before that, you went to Oxford, which was a heavily analytical department.
That's right.
And you wrote your thesis, I believe, on Wittgenstein.
Mostly,
So there was already a turn away from that before you left the academy.
That's right. When I went to Oxford, it was the first time I was really intellectually humbled.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because
so much more competitive than Princeton, or was it because of the graduate versus the bachelor degree? Or
it's not that it was more competitive. It's actually, I wouldn't say Oxford is generally that way, but the particular B.Phil philosophy program is a very serious one, and it's done in a particular kind of analytic philosophical tradition. And in that kind of philosophical tradition prioritizes lucidity, clarity, and novelty of argument in areas that have been very thoroughly explored. And so I found it difficult. I was there, and the kind of rigor of trying to write a good, thoughtful term paper on subjects that were very, very thoroughly explored by many thinkers beforehand, and under the withering cross-examination of a tutor there was hard. I found it hard. But I decided, this is serious philosophy. And I had read works in the analytic tradition before, but this was all that was done, and it was serious. And the other students in the program, they were all intended to be professional philosophers, or at least at that moment, and many of them went on to be. And I had to take it very seriously, and it was very good for me.
So, what did you end up writing your dissertation on? Which specific part about Wittgenstein?
Philosophy of mind and the problem of free will, as understood by Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein didn't really talk much about free will. Mm-hmm. But there's not much doubt that what he thought about it was very similar to what he thought about most topics, which were that there was a confusion of language. That he talked about one of his most famous expressions is that, philosophy is a bewitchment of the intellect by language, right? And so that the goal of philosophy is generally not to solve problems, it's to diagnose the way that we've gotten entangled in a situation.
Dispose of the question itself.
Yeah. You say, like, you thought that there was a problem, there actually wasn't. Let me untangle you from the situation, and you'll realize there was nothing to have worried about in the first place. That's essentially the objective of philosophy for later Wittgenstein. And so the dissertation was an inquiry, is like, does that really work for the most intractable problems that we intuitively feel about the freedom of about our actual first-person agency and about the existence of our mind, in subjective experience? Does this kind of total pragmatic attempt to dissolve the problem, is it persuasive in the two most important questions that we encounter?
Right.
And
what was the conclusion?
I say no, ultimately. Even though I think he's the philosopher that I return the most to in thinking about, about the questions that puzzle me.
I mean, if the Wittgensteinian kind of dissolvement of the question itself doesn't work for these most important questions, do you find it works for slightly less important questions? Is that why you return to Wittgenstein?
Yeah, a lot of questions in philosophy that kind of arise when you push an intuition to a place where it gets to kind of like a skeptical boundary, right? So, for example, pain, like he has his famous discussion of pain. It's like, well, when I say that I'm in pain and you say that you're in pain, I cannot feel your pain and you cannot feel my pain. So how do we know that we're talking about the same thing? And he has a famous metaphor that says, it's like we both had a little box and there was like a little beetle in it. And when I say pain, I'm like, look inside, and it's like, that's mine and you have your own. And he says, is this the right characterization of what we mean when we say that pain is an internal experience? And he says, well, what do we really mean by the word pain? How do we use the word pain? And he kind of dissolves that question essentially. The pain is not that word, and it is not just a referent to a particular private experience. That word is a human artifact that exists in a kind of communicative context. And overall, he was trying to dissolve this idea that language maps to, and there's like a mapping relationship between language and the world.
Which was his early idea.
Which was the earliest idea, right. And instead that the language is a practice, is a kind of pragmatic practice. It's a very, very shallow characterization of it, but that's the single idea if you were to put it in a sentence.
Right. So your claim is that it does work for lesser philosophical questions,
yes,
but not for the most important with philosophy of mind and free will.
Yes, or at least it does not lead to the kind of tranquility that he seems to think is the objective, where you're not bothered by this question anymore, right? Like, I remain very bothered by these questions. And I think anyone who really thinks about this question of the freedom of the will, or what does it mean that my mind, that I have a subjective consciousness anchored in a physical body. If you really reflect on these questions for any duration of time with any seriousness, the deep weirdness of it does not escape. You never leave it. I mean, it remains weird, at least for me.
Does Wittgenstein help in any way? Like, what's the best thing that he would say? And like does it? I know you don't find it ultimately satisfying, but
certain ways that we can kind of overly reify, or say like, well, there's something called the will, right?
Right.
And like, do we have this thing called the will? And that usually leads to the wrong place, because it's an effort. There's not like one thing. There's not one object that has a referent that is at the heart of a problem, right?
There's not a Platonic will that we're trying to understand the characteristic of.
Yes, exactly. Or there's, and he says this about many of the ideas that we can easily reify, like the good, the right, the mind.
Right.
But we should attend more to the practices of what do we mean by, how do we use the word mind?
Right.
Right. And like, when do we, under what situations do we ascribe a mind to other things? What do we really mean by that word? It's not a mysterious thing that we are trying to explore and get to.
And your response is that helps with the most exaggerated forms of reification.
That's right.
But the question still stands. Like,
exactly.
How does my subjective experience work in this
materialist world? Yes. How can it be? And that it does not dissolve that question.
I see.
Yeah.
One of Wittgenstein's projects, to put it very simply, is an end of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like the way that the ancient skeptics, wanted to produce a kind of tranquility through suspension of judgment.
Yeah.
Can I read your dissertation on Wittgenstein as causal to your leave of philosophy in some way?
I don't think so. I think the reasons that I ultimately left the academic world were much more ordinary. You know, they were a worry about what kind of life I would get to lead, about what kind of power I would have, what kind of status, and my ability to make good on a set of expectations that my family had of me. And it's very surprising. My parents were shocked that I went to the business world. They were dismayed.
Wow.
They were dismayed. They did not understand the world of commerce.
Because they were academics themselves.
They just thought that I was best suited to be a student. I mean, to be a scholar, or to be in the academic world. And they wanted me to do what I would be good at. And they were horrified that I would now try to be a salesman or something. And I am a salesman. I don't look much like a salesman. I don't really speak like one, but I describe myself as a salesman with pride, right?
Yeah.
But my parents were dismayed by that. They came around, but they were shocked.
Let me try to push you one more time here. Wittgenstein, I believe, for a lot of his students, I think at Cambridge, he encouraged them to go to trade.
Yeah.
Partially because of his, I wouldn't say like looking down upon philosophy, but thinking a lot of the philosophical questions are kind of, the philosophers tying themselves into their own knots.
Yeah, that's right.
So I totally hear you that your concerns were a lot more practical, instrumental, but surely studying Wittgenstein for 3 years must have also devalued your opinion of philosophy a lot more, especially academic philosophy.
Yeah.
Is there something there?
That's right. And I came to admire other pursuits more. Like I found a kind of admiration, or you could even call it fetish, of people who studied like the really pure technical fields, like especially math and physics.
Yeah.
And I recognized I had, perhaps under different circumstances with more focus, I could have ended up studying those, but I didn't. And I had chosen the path of the humanities.
During Wittgenstein, you had a greater appreciation for math and physics.
That's right. Or I mean, that it started earlier than that, and said, if I'm like wow, this is serious work, and this is a little bit more, I don't know,
wishy-washy.
Yeah, a little more masturbatory or whatever. And the bigger concern was, can I really be great at this? Can I be good at this? I can imagine spending decades in pleasurable contemplation and writing this and dialogue but can I be really great at this? And I got to see great when I was at Oxford. Thomas Nagel came and he led a seminar with Derek Parfit and, a number of other very, very luminary philosophers. And I realized this is an elite group of incredibly brilliant people. And it's not that it's radically improbable that I could ever be one of them, but it's a long journey. It's a long monastic journey.
Where do you think you got this sort of need to win?
I had a happy childhood, but one that had a sense that it was in preparation for something larger, or something more. There was still a struggle ahead, a kind of generational struggle ahead to make a good life in this country that wasn't there in the first effort. That there had been a lot of sacrifice. My mother would say to me, not to make me feel guilty, just to confide in me. She said, I left everything that was familiar to me, everything that I knew. And I saw that she was kind of a stranger in a strange land. She actually spoke very good English, but she never understood American customs. She never understood American practices. And she tried so hard. She would subscribe to Better Homes and Garden and try to make pineapple upside down cake and liver casserole, watch my Little League baseball games. And she tried so hard to be American, but the gap was wide. It was very wide. And I had a sense of accountability to her. Like, she came here because she wanted something better for me. And and it was not just her, it was multiplied across a larger extended family that said, you're the hope. You're the hope. They didn't even say those words to me, but I felt
it was implied. Yeah, I definitely relate to that as well, as basically like a first gen immigrant as well. We talked about your philosophical journey and your philosophical views. Now I want to dive deeper into your Guidewire journey.
Sure.
And let's begin with this idea, tunneling through Granite. Tell us about that.
It was a way of framing the company's journey and its task as one without shortcuts, and to say there's difficulty ahead, and when you're trying to get around the mountains, maybe you'll find a secret passageway. Maybe you'll find a way not to have to cross it. And we are, for better or worse, we are embracing the necessity of going straight through, and that's our strategy. It's a full frontal assault on the hardest problem, and it will be very, very hard. But our reward will be, that it's harder for anyone else who may follow, and the reward of its completion.
But when someone asked you what's on the other side of the granite, You said more granite.
Yeah. Well, that was the joke always, because it's like, so what's on the other side of this granite? And I said, there's no other side. It's infinite granite. It's all there is. So therefore, in this kind of stoic sense, you must enjoy the tunneling.
Right. But
that's what I have
isn't
to offer.
That a form of masochism? Like to confuse the difficult with the good?
Well, the masochist fetishizes the difficulty. The fetish finds pleasure in difficulty for its own sake, seeks out difficulty because it's pleasurable.
Right.
That's different from an embrace of difficulty. Okay? An embrace is not the same as a fetish. An embrace is saying, this is what is necessary. We're going to do what is necessary. And I think it's different.
Have you heard of the Chinese parable, 愚公移山?
No.
So there's an exact Chinese parable about someone tunneling through granite to move a mountain.
Is that right?
And I mean, long short of it is, he's like, I'm going to move this mountain. And then he's like, well, you're never going to move this mountain because you can only get a bucket of rocks every day. And he's like, well, I can't, but my sons can, and their sons can, and their sons can. Eventually it'll be moved. And it's a happy ending because eventually the gods are sort of so moved that
they do it on their behalf.
Yeah.
There is something else that was part of the message, which was embrace that incrementalism. Is that like today we will just take steps in the right direction, and tomorrow we will take more steps in that direction. And over time, just like on a long journey, you look back and you say, look at the distance we've traversed, right? That's the only thing you can do.
So many of the traits that I uncovered about you, I see in myself. Whether it's the sort of work ethic, it's the sort of 0 to 1 hyper-commitment, or all or nothing, the overachiever, the desire to sort of work on hard problems that you can tunnel a little bit on, rather than try to come up with like a one brilliant insight that kind of changes everything. How much of this do you think has to deal with, I guess not your East Asian upbringing, but your family's sort of East Asian environment that you were brought up in?
Americans have certain notions about Asians because that sometimes are distorted, because what they see is a particular demographic slice of Asia that because of the immigration rules and other things that were happening in each of those countries at a certain time came over here. I don't associate this kind of striver, insecure, overachiever intensity to being Asian as such as to being the immigrant, to being the outsider, and to coming to a place where to chart some other path to success, because the conventional ones are not going to be given to you, including romantically, I think, which is a factor. And it was certainly true for me. It was certainly true. I wanted to succeed because I felt I had started at a disadvantage, and I didn't bear any animus towards anyone for that. Yeah. I didn't feel like that was unfair. It just felt like that was the truth of it, and therefore it was going to take more.
You described company building as a Nietzschean enterprise. That is at once both heroic and tragic. So tell us about that.
Well, it's heroic because you are doing something very audacious. You're proceeding with huge numbers of unknowns, and you're bearing a massive amount of that risk, on yourself, right? And that ought to be rewarded, and it's a beautiful thing that it is rewarded, right? So that part's heroic. But there's, there are tragic aspects as well. And the most tragic thing is you have bound yourself to something that may go horribly wrong, that is open-ended in its nature, that you are making promises to people that you may disappoint, including to yourself, right? And that can have a tragic quality. And I've seen that as well, where entrepreneurs, they feel that it is their destiny, and they become addicted even to the certain qualities that certain characteristic experiences of entrepreneurship, right? One of those is that you get to set the agenda. So in any company, regardless of whether it's doing well or doing poorly, when you're the CEO, you are lord of the realm. And that is a certain intoxicating feeling, right? And some people just always want to do that. They just want to do it relentlessly over and over again, even when they don't have
the chops.
Yeah, when they're not actually cut out for it in the other ways, and that can be really tragic.
Right, because it's their fatal character flaw that sort of keeps them coming back into this.
Right. There's another aspect of tragedy that I can speak to personally, which is that you leave something of yourself in this enterprise that you don't always control. In my case, I do not control my company. I didn't have the assets. I was one of a large founding group. I was naive. The balance of power was very much in the favor of investors. And so, I didn't have control of the company. Even when it went public, I had very modest ownership of it. The thing that I had poured myself in, that I think in many respects bears some of my personhood is embedded in that company. It is now divorced from me. I cannot recover it. It is in the world. I made many promises on its behalf, but I no longer control it.
It's both you and not you, and the tension there is what creates the tragedy.
Sartre talks about it as well. He talks about your shadow, that there is yourself as you experience it in the first person, but then there is as you are seen by the other that sees you. And it kind of attaches to you as a shadow, this appendage that you don't get to control, that's just like linked to you. Yeah. And, so this company forever, I mean, especially as I'm in the professional world, I am associated with it. I am very powerfully associated with something that is no longer me. And I have a sadness about that.
Interesting. Do you enjoy the actual day-to-day of running a company? The reason I ask this is because when I was making the decision to leave the company that I helped start and to return back into contemplation, the calculus was this, and it was a no-brainer once I framed it this way. Building this company, even if I win, I lose. Even if I spend all of my 20s, this becomes a decacorn, we all become fabulously rich. There's something about not spending my most vivacious years on something I know I love, because the day-to-day I don't actually love that much, what will be a failure. What I'm doing now, and I genuinely feel this way, even if I lose, I win. Even if after 2 years I run out of all my funding, no one watches my stuff, the fact that we get to have this conversation, this is the reward.
It's beautiful.
And so I've turned around what success has meant from this kind of deferral. And again, I would say it's a very East Asian kind of trait, this ability to defer, sometimes multi-generationally, to a much more perhaps Western kind of like, just want to live. I just want to like the moments I'm living. Yeah,
that's a beautiful thing, and I really commend and admire that you found that in life. And there are pursuits in life that are like that. I'm a pianist, and I get to play works of exquisite beauty. And whether or not I become great at it or become famous and get to perform at Carnegie Hall, I get to do that, and that's its own intrinsic inner reward. A company is not like that. The entrepreneurial journey is not like that. It does not.
Is it like that for anyone, or no?
I don't think so. No, I mean, it has characteristic rewards that are not just about commercial success, but it's not, you can't just say, I'm doing this company because
I like board meetings.
Yeah, exactly. A company the reward is the company's success. It is its flourishing and it is its growth. Actually, along the way, sometimes employees would say, why do we have to grow so much? When we grow, we have to bring in new people. They may not share our values. It gets complicated. Why do we have to grow? And my answer was always the same. There's only two kinds of companies, those that grow and the other kind. There's no other choice. There's no, that's just stasis, and stasis is death. So we have to, and that, just the imperative of that is exhausting, but there's no escape from that. Otherwise, find someone to be a pianist then, or a philosopher. I think you were asking, did I enjoy that?
the day-to-day, yeah.
A lot of it I did enjoy. There was a part that I detested and that I would do very differently, and it's one of my regrets. The part that I really detested was the travel. Selling was such an important part of the job, and the nature of what we built was that it was a very consequential decision for any of our customers to buy it. They were taking enormous career risk. It was enormous capital risk to buy, not just what they paid us, but the whole transformation project that it would take to implement the software and all the business change that would have to go along with it. And so it was very personal. The sales were very personal. At a certain point, I, as the principal in the company, would have to tell the buyer or the other individuals that were influencing the decision to say, I pledge my honor, my company's honor, to the success of this project. We will not let it fail. We will have it, and I will underwrite that with not only my good faith, but my very body. I will be here in person to make sure that this thing succeeds. And I had a ritual where I would write my phone number down on a business card. You call me at any hour. Don't worry about the time. I will always answer. And again, 99% of the time, no one would call. 1% of the time they did. And then I would be on a plane. And eventually that 1%, they added up. And to the point where I was flying 250,000 miles, 300,000 miles a year. And, a lot of the times just within the US. And, and the kind of, the toll that took on my health, on my sleep, on my sanity, my sense of, just of equilibrium was actually was great. I just said, this is the only way that we can sell. I have to pledge my whole self to it, and that requires me to be wherever I need to be. And I think that was overblown. I think it was It was not done out of megalomania, out of narcissism. It was done, I felt, out of necessity. And I know that I could have moderated that. I could have done better. And it diminished my effectiveness, ultimately. So that's probably my single greatest regret.
What do you enjoy about the day-to-day?
I enjoyed the sense of agency. One thing I always tell CEOs, your power is the power of agenda. You get to decide what is being discussed, who is in the room, when is it over, what's in the frame of discussion, what is not in the frame of discussion. And once I understood that, it was very rewarding to me because I didn't have to be the one to make the correct answer, come to the correct decision all the time. This is who was accountable to that answer. Us coming to the right answer and then being definitive and saying this discussion is over or it's not over. And that's very rewarding, and I don't have that today. I value that. And I valued being able to address the collective. To be the one that embodied the purpose. Not as the Messiah, just as the spokesperson for the thing that we are all collectively doing together, and to feel that appreciated, to feel a resonance from the people who worked in the company, sometimes for many years, to say, you are giving voice to why this is a meaningful thing, why we are glad to be here. And that was intoxicating, actually.
See, now that you are an investor, a lot of those things no longer hold. But so if I were forced to go re-enter into industry, I would for sure be an investor instead of a founder. Because you're able to rescue a lot of the intellectual sort of activities.
That's right.
That you were able, and you have a lot more control over your schedule and
There's less repetition. So one part of the CEO role is that don't underestimate how much repetition is part of your job.
Yeah.
In fact,
like just going to the gym.
Yeah. You just have to do so many reps of you have to repeat with almost, with exasperating redundancy, the same messages. And that is its own purpose, that everyone understands that what you are doing. It's that hard to keep this many consciousnesses moving in roughly the right direction together. So investing does not have that repetitive quality. There's a lot of context switching that's very pleasurable. So I can learn this domain, I can learn that domain, and things that I would never have had the time to indulge. And you get to meet someone who's extremely passionate, and that part is very rewarding. The part that's not rewarding is that the vast majority of your interactions end up as a null. You have a long discussion, you do analysis, you exchange information, you build a relationship, and the answer is nothing.
Right.
You don't do anything. Maybe you've learned something.
Right.
Maybe
what was building most of it is not null. You're making.
You're not. You're making.
You're tunneling granite, right?
Yeah. You're tapping away. Maybe you've only scratched away, a millimeter, but you have scratched away a millimeter.
Right.
It's not like we've had a lot of conversations and done our job today and nothing has happened. And that is intrinsic to being an investor. And I have not fully adapted to it. It's a little weird.
Let's go to the values of Guidewire.
Sure.
They're integrity, rationality, and collegiality. In my experience, the worst kind of company values are just kind of throwing nice sounding words that is not only not embodied, but is hypocritically violated.
That's the worst.
The best kind, I find, is not just when the values are embodied, but when people clearly recognize what the trade-off of the value is.
Correct.
And they still take the good path. So, for example, move fast and break things.
Yes.
We're going to value efficiency over stability. Both two good things.
Yes.
But I'm telling you there's a relative trade-off.
That's right.
What is integrity, rationality, and collegiality? What are their trade-offs?
Yeah, I think you put it exactly right. Integrity is telling the truth, most fundamentally. And, it's very easy to tell the truth when things are going great. So it's only a value if there is a moment where it's extremely inconvenient. Right. It's very painful to tell the truth, right? And what will that pain be? It will be in disappointing someone. It will be making it harder to sell. It will be exposing your vulnerability or your weakness or your incompleteness or your immaturity to someone that you would prefer to convey an impression of competence, of perfection, of completion, etc. Right? That is the trade-off. It will be painful, right? Or rationality. What is the trade-off in trying to make the rational decision? There's a lot of trade-offs, actually. First of all, you have to empower. You are allowing people to second-guess authority because they can demand a rational explanation. And for people in authority, you have ceded a lot of your power. You, instead of just saying, well, we will go north because I have decided north, you are saying, well, I have a duty now to explain to you the rationale, why north and why not northeast. And that's, you have ceded power and you have imposed a new obligation on yourself.
Right. A higher principle other than the hierarchy itself.
Right. Exactly. Other than the hierarchy. And that's a trade-off. And it's time consuming. It's energy. It may be exasperating, right? And collegiality, which express this idea that we are
Ends.
We are ends. We are not means. And the very Kantian, the Kantian idea. The Kantian idea. And what does it mean to do that? Well, it means that you cannot decide, hey, this is the year of efficiency, and we're going to slash a lot of people, because you should take deep accountability for the fact that you made that hiring, those incorrect decisions in the first place. That you are going to make sure that there's a kind of equality of treatment, not just in the HR minimal procedural sense, but in the way that everyone is addressed, in the way that everyone is expected to comport and behave with each other. For example, it's not acceptable to have a person be very responsive to the CEO, but be completely neglectful to their subordinates. So these are all expensive. The values are expensive. But if they're not expensive, then they're vacuous. They're vacuous.
Yeah.
Right. And it's on the short list of things I'm deeply proud of in the company, that we abided by these values.
So the first question I want to ask you is, we talked about how there's a rational way to build companies, and then there's like a messianic way to build companies.
Yeah.
Are the rest of the two values also just preferences that happen to work well for you and your team? Or do you think they're universal constants? For example, collegiality. There are companies that have done incredibly well that treat people
completely dispensable. Yeah.
Completely disposable. People are ruthless. They're
Yes.
ruthless. They're means.
Yeah.
That's the first philosophical question.
Yeah. And I would say, you could call it a preference, but you would say it's a different model. There are models of success that are emphatically not collegial, right?
Yeah.
I mean, most classically and famously in Silicon Valley would be the Oracle culture, right? It's a place where, yes, if you do well, you can be lavishly rewarded, and if you don't, you get your face ripped off. And that model works, right? And it's insanely hierarchical. It's completely transactional. But who could second guess its success? It has worked spectacularly well over generations now, right? And it's just a model that you can either embrace or you can reject, and we emphatically rejected it.
Right.
Same with integrity. Now, I think this is the most fraught one, because when a company lies externally, that's one thing. That's already pernicious. That's already bad. But when a company is in the habit of lying lying externally, then it's lying to itself. It knows that if it gets good at lying to itself.
I see.
And when a company starts lying to it, this is almost like a Hegelian point, right? But when you start getting good at lying to yourself, then everything falls apart.
So these three different values, they're different in nature, where the latter two, rationality and collegiality, seem to be preferences.
Yes.
Right? You can build a non-rational messianic company.
Yes.
You can build a non-collegial competitive company.
Yes.
But integrity seems to be a universal constant.
That's what I believe, because when a company becomes corrupted to the core, where it just lies with then it has the seeds of its own destruction. And it's not, I don't mean the moral destruction. I mean, it's not because there's some karmic enforcer of the right in the world. I don't believe such a thing exists.
Right.
It just happens.
Causally.
It's just a causality. You engender a rot within the body that eventually causes it to collapse. And there's different kinds of rot, but one of them is where an organization starts habitually lying to itself, right? And it just can't function, because it's the people who start running the place become scoundrels, and they stab each other in the back, and they say things about their product that aren't true.
How do you reconcile the value of integrity with what you said about when communicating to the company, they want to hear these things from the CEO?
Yes.
Like, things are going well. I mean, there's not a direct tension there, but you see how there's like a little bit of a,
But there is no tension. The things that really matter, which are, what are our real prospects? Are we really doing well, or are we not? Does our product really work, or does it not? What is our actual status? What is our actual standing? Right? These are the things that you have to be honest about. And it's it's easy to say that, you should just tell the simple truth. I can tell you from my own experience, the kind of the intensity of the temptations, not so much to say that black is white, and up is down.
But gray is white, or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. And to shade. And it takes a careful discernment to say, how can I always convey confidence, even in the moment of greatest difficulty, without ever distorting the underlying truth?
Right.
And this is hard. Now, because you have a duty to always be confident, even if you don't feel it. That's the one thing that you are allowed to be dishonest about, in my opinion, as a CEO or the founder of the company. You must be confident. You must say, in this darkest hour, we will find a way.
Even if you don't believe it.
Even if you don't believe it. That is your duty. And the moment at which you're not willing to do that anymore is the moment you've got to resign. Or you've got to find a successor immediately.
It's a noble lie of sorts.
Yeah. And that's the only one. That's the only one I think you're allowed. Because it's intrinsic to
constitutive to the role itself.
It's constitutive of the role itself. That's right. And in fact, it's a noble lie in that sense as it comes up in philosophy as well, which is that is what people want. People really they crave, they require stability from their leaders. It's a weird thing to say at this moment with who the body politic has elected president, but I think in general it's certainly in every enterprise that I've seen, people long for that constancy. That's what I meant by repetition. And so a leader who is manic is very unsettling for followers, for the team, right? Because they think, John's ecstatic right now. He's bouncing off the walls with how exhilarated he is about how things are going, but now he's depressed. And that's deeply disturbing. It's like you don't want it's like a child, you don't want to see your parents, exuberantly happy one moment and then distressed the next moment. That's not encouraging. That's deeply unsettling. And I think it's actually another duty, maybe it's a secondary duty to telling the truth or projecting confidence, but it's a secondary duty to present a kind of constancy, to say, we may move, the water level may move up or down, but on the horizon, it's level. And that was one of the developmental gifts for me in the journey, was to learn at least to project that, even if I didn't always feel it.
Cross-examination time. Mm-hmm. I'm going to read another quote from you.
Sure.
That seems to be, again, not in direct tension, but philosophically seems to be in some tension. But for the startup, the enemy stands in the way of all good things. They are indolent and unworthy. They should suffer defeat and disgrace. You want their children to go hungry. Lest this sound too bloodthirsty, I hasten to add, the enemy doesn't have to be a human. The most effective slide I ever used was a picture of Guidewire's enemy, a green screen terminal. Why is it so important to name the enemy? Because it activates the energies of your team, your tribal impulse to win as a group.
Yeah.
The tension that I'm seeing here is what you just told me, is that, you want to calm the excitement of the group. You want to, reason guides the way.
Yes.
And here, you want to fan the flames a little bit. And so, how do you reconcile
but here's the distinction, right? There's what are our prospects? And then who do we want to kill, right? You can't be a peaceful insurgent. You're trying to tear something down. There's some zero-sum aspect to what you want to do. We're going to succeed because others don't deserve where they are right now. We're going to tear some of that down. We're going to eat their lunch. And there's a kind of there's a bloodlust in that. There's a tribal intensity of us versus them. And I think a company has to harness that. That's one of the assets that you have as a big company cannot do this. I will tell you, my company today is completely devoid of those feelings. It has no sense of who their enemies were. They are tranquil,
fat and happy. Yeah, right.
Let's just say tranquil to a fault, and maybe you could say it's great. Some people should be tranquil, but my company has no trace of that. Of those life forces anymore. When you're a startup, you have to make the most of those. You have to engender them. And if you can't, then maybe you're in the wrong business, because you can be ice cold. You can be ice cold in your own prosecution of an intensity that we're going to savage the enemy now. And that's the most lethal combination of all. Right. And in fact, that's trying to think of the right character, in popular culture.
Well, there's a Chinese saying here, 君子报仇10年不晚. For the gentleman to gain his revenge, even 10 years is not too long.
There you go.
It's his ability to, it's called almost like the romantic thing, to defer the sort of satisfaction and to still have reason to be in control. Yeah.
I think this is the corniest example, but like the John Wick character, in the action movie. So this is blood pressure doesn't even rise, but he is motivated by a burning hatred, right? It's a revenge movie, a ridiculous cartoon revenge movie, but he's animated by almost genocidal rage, but in his prosecution of that mission,
cold and effective.
He's lethal and cold, right?
Interesting. So that's another interesting tension that the startup and the founder needs to embody.
Yes.
A kind of uncontrollable motivation that is somehow tamed by the most rational forces.
That's right. My Silicon Valley hero was Andy Grove. He led Intel for many, many, many years before it became a lesser company. But Andy Grove was he was very famously he was a hyper-rational, super calm, data-driven guy. But he would say he was animated by a kind of genocidal intensity. He says, we must crush every competitor. We have to bury them in...
Carthage must fall.
Yeah, we must bury them, in the crib, we have to drown every baby that could grow up to be our enemy. I mean, he had that kind of intensity at the same time that he was, an engineer, hyper-rational, just the facts.
I see. You started with 6 more or less equal co-founders.
Yes.
In one of the early financing rounds, you sold half of the company away.
Yes.
For what?
The first
round.
That's right.
$4 million. Was your lack of ultimate ownership? You said by the time you IPO, you had a very modest ownership.
That's right.
Was that ever a motivational issue?
It was, but again, there was no choice. And this is again part of the tragedy. You can add this to the tragedy list. We had committed ourselves, and we had to make it succeed. And it's very unfair. It was deeply, deeply unfair. And there is no Platonic calculator to tell you what exactly is fair.
Right.
But
it's also obvious when it's not fair.
But it's obvious when it's not. When it's not. And we bore all the risk, and it was not right that just how that ultimate return came. Now, as it turns out, the surplus was so great that it was a very happy ending, and it became even greater still. But nonetheless, it was unfair. And by today's lights, you would say it was outrageous. I mean, any founder, and when I describe it, people can't really.
Yeah, I had to double take when
founders can't really believe it and and it puts me sometimes in a funny dilemma talking to founders, today, including investments that I've made, where they say, well, in order for me to feel motivated, I'm going to need more, and and they have 18 points in the company, and you said, you understand, 2 years into a 20-year journey, I had a quarter of what you have, right?
Wow.
Right. And so do you understand that it's very hard for me to relate to the sentiment.
But it's not hard, right? Because you did struggle with that.
I did struggle with it, but I walked the walk, right? But I have to accept that, we're all, we measure ourselves comparatively, my grandfather grew up in a village where he was not allowed to urinate at his school. His mother, my great-grandmother, compelled him to run back to his house, which was 2 or 3 miles away from the school, because the nitrogen in his urine was too important for
the school to have it, yeah,
for the fertilizing of the field. So imagine that level of poverty, right? And you contrast that in absolute terms, to the life I've gotten to lead, even before my company's success. And you need to have these kinds of correctives to a sense of blasting into infinity what you require for things to feel fair.
So my intuition is that this was not a nagging thing for you, right?
No, it was. It was. But there were the thing that was demoralizing at moments was a feeling that this journey is very, very hard, but we're doing it. We're succeeding. We're making progress. And then to be second guessed by people who felt like interlopers. That's the time when I felt like alienated labor. I'm working this hard to enrich people who have no part in the creation of this value. And that was a bitter feeling. That was a bitter feeling. And it was even more bitter when it's bad enough to work on behalf of people who are not contributing to its success.
Right.
Now I'm working on time who are actively impeding its success. I'm carrying, a 50 kilogram load up a very steep hill, and someone just came and put another 10 kilograms in. That's embittering. And those moments were very, 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 very challenging.
How did you get over that?
There was no choice.
Necessity.
Well, there was also looking to the future and to say, there will be a day, it's not today, but there will be a day when things will be on my terms. And that day came.
Right. The kind of romantic deferral, again,
exactly.
Deferral.
It's a deferral.
Last question. It wouldn't be a proper interview in 2025 without talking about AI in some degree. You recently made a video about AI where you were quite dismissive about its ability for deep reasoning as well as for creativity. Tell us about that.
Well, I'm a student here, an observer, and and my opinion doesn't have a lot of predictive value. All I can say is the things that I observed directly, right? I don't see evidence of what I would call reasoning, anything like. I see, remarkable summarization, but sometimes that summarization is often some is incoherent or contradictory or
hallucinating.
It wouldn't come anywhere close to, let's say, the precision that comprises like a rigorous philosophical argument, right? There's just, it's at a level of kind of squishiness, of kind of like vagueness that you get the gist of like what a certain person thought or what the direction of something, but that would not comprise like a rigorous philosophical argument.
Even for O1 Pro and the best model.
At least what I've seen. Now, I have heard, and I believe, that these models are able to do things that are incredible, like with respect to solving, Math Olympiad level problems. And I must credit that's happening. And that's a very sophisticated form of reasoning indeed. But in terms of the kind of reasoning that I understand and that was trained in, I don't see that ability, right?
Right.
And
it's the tight kind of logical structure that we just described.
That's right. Yeah. In like what would be a satisfying philosophical argument, right? Like they're much more directional, impressionistic. Now, I also have some quantitative interests, and so I took it upon myself one weekend to say, let me just do the best prompt engineering I can with O1, and let's see if I can teach it. It's a subject that I happen to know something about, blackjack card counting. And let me see whether I can get a card counting strategy under a certain set of conditions that I understand very well. And I spent a good, 6-7 hours of like prompt engineering and trying to get it to work, and I could not. And that might have been my failure, but it just made mistake after mistake after mistake, and places where I would say, but this is inconsistent with what you said earlier. Right. And the thing that was disconcerting is that the whole time it was very confident. It was saying, this will be better. Okay, I solved the problem that you identified. Here's a new answer, and it would be wrong. So I'm talking to many, many companies that are adding different kind of AI capabilities, are things that are extremely impressive and yet so far short of what I would call real reasoning, let alone real creativity, let alone, ability to come up with completely novel solutions to problems. So that's just my very limited keyhole.
It's just your like anthropological report.
That's just my report of my observations. As a very interested and engaged person. We're in a weird moment where even some of the largest software companies in the world are saying like we could just euthanize the engineer and AI can handle it. I find that hugely implausible. I mean, obviously there's some categories of software development that are highly mechanical and that probably are within the purview of the state of the art. But everything that I witnessed, and I did not build our products, but I was witness to their development and involved in a lot of getting the requirements right and obviously getting them implemented. And everything that I saw in that, it's inconceivable to me that AI could possibly build. There was so much judgment, so many
complexity that you had to fold in.
Yes, and so many nuanced decisions about like, should we generalize here or should we not? What should be configurable, what shouldn't be? Where should we anticipate a need for something that could have to be extended in the future? There was so much nuanced judgment there that it seems inconceivable to me that could be, within the purview of an LLM today. Finally, I also look at it through the optic of the lens of the company, the industry that I know best, which is insurance. I mean, I spent 20 some years studying the insurance industry, serving the insurance industry, and I see what AI is doing. And in some ways, AI is transformational. It's doing some amazing things, like, for example, translating an enormous, complex commercial policy submission, and that's just written in PDFs and spreadsheets, and converting it into structured form. And that's awesome, and that's incredibly impressive. But yet, it still seems quite a distance away from doing the other kinds of deeper judgment that people in the insurance industry actually do.
Right. Even on a practical level,
even on a practical level, I see a lot of. It seems like there's still very substantial gaps before it can do. I think, but that could be a completely different story.
That's really interesting,
time.
Marcus. Thank you for a fascinating interview.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Elaborate on your fascination with games. Because you're still a big fan of board games.
Yes, I love games. I would say I think that games are an art form. They're as important an artifact in our culture as great architecture, as music, as film. I think they're an extraordinary medium of human expression and creativity. I have this very simple theory about what games comprise, that they have three ingredients. That a game is, you have play, which, that you enact something that's unreal. You enter a magic circle where you say, you're an orc and I'm an elf, or, I am Scipio Africanus and you're a Hannibal of Carthage and we're going to fight the Punic War or the Peloponnesian War or whatever. So you have an element of play, but you do that under a set of rules. It's not a free-for-all. There's a structure. There's something that comprises a turn. And then third, you have a sense of winning. Like, what is the objective of this game? And then when is the game over? And what games comprise is that these three ingredients working together in a harmonious way. It's play, rules, and winning. And if you think about other facets of life, you rarely have these ingredients together. Sometimes you have a concept of winning under rules, like you're in a debate, or you're trying to pass a law in Congress, or win an election, right? Sometimes you just have winning, but that's domination. You're just trying to dominate another person, or a country is trying to dominate another. It's not happening in a context that's both playful and structured, but also has a sense of contest. And that's a very, very beautiful allegory of like many, many facets of human life and games allegorize things like making decisions under uncertainty, understanding the intersubjective state of people, to negotiate with them, to persuade them, to manage resources, to balance short and long-term trade-offs. And so it's like a palette for expressing a huge portion of the human experience, I think. And we're living in a renaissance of games right now. In some ways you could say our culture has become so coarse, so fragmented, so vulgar, so shallow. But I'll tell you, in the domain of games, in board games, we're living in like the peak years of the Renaissance, right? It's like 1565 right now, and it's a beautiful thing. So I love games.
What about the combination of the three? Like why is the existence of all three in games, board games specifically, what does that bring out? Is it simply like a good kaleidoscope of human nature as a whole, or what specifically is brought out by three?
Many things. So first, it's, we are creatures of imagination, right? And when we get to exercise our imagination, that it nourishes something within us, right? But in games, you get to participate in that imagination in a kind of structured way. And like the very best games can tell sometimes an allegory. I'll give you an example. There's a game designer today that I think is a genius. His name is Cole Wehrle. And he designs games of incredible intricacy and like historical sophistication. He has this one game called John Company, and it's about the East India Company, the British East India Company in the 17th to 19th century, right? And in this game, you play members of a family, of different families that have kind of a dynastic involvement and collaboration in the management of the British East India Company, right? You have to govern the company together. You have to generate profit out of it. But so in that sense, you were cooperating, but you were also competing, because you're not just trying for the company to do well, you were trying to succeed as an individual family. And the way you enact that is by buying luxury property and marrying well back in England. And so all of these attributes are kind of enacted through rules. That's the thing. It's not like a play acting. It's not
anything goes.
It's not improv comedy or cosplay. Right? The game is very structured. There are rules, there are different phases, the things that you can and cannot do, but it enacts that, right? And at the end of this game, it's a magical experience, but on the other, you realize you are interior to the experience, or at least one person's interpretation of the experience of what it was to participate first in many different things. The subjugation of the Indian subcontinent and the horrors of that, but in a way that was commercially oriented. In what it is to work with other people, but at the same time that you were trying to compete and beat them at the same time. The kind of the tensions of co-opetitive dynamics that are actually a huge part of the business world. And you are interior to that experience, to this historical moment, in a way that you cannot get just from reading a book, because you have actually played those roles, and you have thought and inhabited and took on the motivations and the goals and the maximizing intent that people at that moment had. And it's only games that allow you to do this, right? At their best. Now,
it's like literature in some sense.
It's a kind of literature.
That
exactly.
You get to embody something that you wouldn't otherwise have had access to.
That's right. So like if you read, you read a great work of literature, then you can propel you into a moment in time, and maybe you can inhabit that first-person subjectivity of a certain character. Games, in a way, go a step further, where you are actually making decisions. You are actually deciding you are not a witness to their decisions. You are the agent of those decisions. And in the best games, it leads to a kind of revelatory understanding of something that before might have been behind the veil of history. Now, that's only some games. There are other games that just purely exercise your mind, like abstract games like chess, or there are other games that come in incredible variety. And Anyway,
Yeah.
as you can see, I could rhapsodize indefinitely.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you like these kinds of discussions, I think you fit in great with the ecosystem we're building at Cosmos. We fund research, incubate, and invest in AI startups, and believe that philosophy is critical to building technology. If you want to join our ecosystem of philosopher builders, you can find roles we're hiring for, events we're hosting, and other ways to get involved on jonathanb.com/cosmos. Thank you.